Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. I'd been hearing about Hiker's Hollow for years, a secluded, unmarked trail deep in the forest, known only to a handful of local campers. It was famous for its eerie reputation, a place where people would go and come back different. The rumors drew me in, like they always do. I wanted to see if the tales were true, if the hollow was as haunted as everyone claimed. So one weekend, I packed up my gear and headed out. The hike-in was beautiful. The trees were tall and dense, their branches reaching across the sky like fingers intertwined, blocking out the sun and casting everything in a cool green light. I followed the unmarked path winding through the trees, feeling the weight of the stories pressing in on me. They said that once you passed a certain point, you'd feel it. A heaviness, a pressure, like the forest itself was watching you. I thought it was just a story, but as I got deeper, I started to feel it too. By the time I found a spot to set up camp, the light was already starting to fade. I hurried to pitch my tent and start a fire, and as the flames crackled and sparked, I felt a strange sense of comfort. I'd heard the hollow was beautiful, but it was eerie too. The trees were thicker here, their trunks twisted and gnarled, as if they'd been bent by some unseen force. I had just settled by the fire, feeling the warmth chase away the evening chill, when I heard a noise, a twig snapping somewhere behind me. I turned, expecting to see an animal, but there was nothing there, just shadows and silence. I told myself it was just my nerves, but the feeling lingered. It was as if the whole forest had gone silent, holding its breath. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The words seemed to hang in the air, swallowed by the shadows. And then I saw him, a man standing just at the edge of the firelight watching me. He looked like a hiker. His clothes were dirty, worn, as if he'd been out here for days. But it was his eyes that unsettled me the most. They were dark, empty, like twin pools of ink reflecting the flames. "Hey, you okay?" I asked, taking a step closer. "Nah." He didn't answer, just stared at me with that hollow gaze, and then, without a word, he turned and walked back into the darkness. I should have let him go, should have stayed by the fire, but something compelled me to follow. I grabbed my flashlight and walked after him, shining the beam into the shadows. The light flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw him again, just ahead of me, but when I reached the spot, he was gone. The forest was different here. The trees were thicker, their branches twisting together overhead, blocking out the sky. I walked deeper, the light from my campfire fading behind me, and the silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. It was then that I saw the clearing. In the middle of it was a circle of stones, arranged in a perfect ring, and at the center, something that looked like an old well, its edges crumbling with age. As I approached, I felt that heaviness again, a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I shone my flashlight into the well, but it was too deep, the darkness too thick to see the bottom. That's when I heard the voice, soft and distant, coming from somewhere below. "Help me." I stumbled back, my heart racing. The voice was faint, like it was coming from miles away, but there was something familiar about it. I leaned over the edge, listening, straining to hear, and then it came again, louder this time. "Help me." It sounded like my own voice. I stepped back, suddenly aware of how cold it had gotten. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, and the shadows around me seemed to shift, like they were watching, waiting. I turned to leave, but something held me in place, some invisible force rooting me to the spot. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized I wasn't alone. Figures began to emerge from the trees, their forms shrouded in darkness. They looked like hikers, their clothes dirty and torn, their faces pale and empty. They moved in unison, circling the well, their eyes fixed on me with a hunger that made my skin crawl. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. And then one of them stepped forward. I recognized him. It was the man I'd seen before, the one who'd led me here. His face was blank, his eyes empty, but there was something in the way he moved, something familiar. I reached out, almost without thinking, and as my hand touched his, a flood of images filled my mind. I saw myself wandering through the forest, calling out for help. I saw myself alone, afraid, searching for a way out. And then I saw myself standing at the edge of the well, staring into the darkness as the shadows closed in around me. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, and the figures began to close in, their eyes fixed on me, unblinking. I turned and ran, the shadows seeming to stretch and twist around me, reaching out with twisted, gnarled fingers. I could hear their footsteps behind me, soft but relentless, as I sprinted through the trees, back towards the camp. When I burst into the clearing, the fire was out, the campsite empty. My heart pounded as I looked around, trying to find some sign of where I'd come from, but everything was different. The trees were taller, the shadows deeper, and there was no sign of the path I'd taken. It was as if the forest had swallowed it whole. I stood there alone, the silence pressing in around me, and I knew I was trapped. The hollow had taken me, just like it had taken them. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that I'd become just another ghost, another figure wandering the forest, calling for help that would never come. And if you ever find yourself in Hiker's Hollow, if you hear someone calling out from the darkness, don't follow them. Turn back, get out, while you still can. Because once you're in that place, it won't let you go. It will trap you, keep you until you're nothing but a shadow, a whisper, a faint cry lost in the trees. So if you ever hear a voice calling your name, remember this: it could be the forest, or it could be me. I'd been looking forward to that camping trip for months. Blackwood Forest had a reputation for being untamed and untouched by modern society, a paradise for those seeking an escape from civilization. It was perfect. No cell phone reception, no noise pollution, just raw, unfiltered nature. But now I wish I'd never set foot in that place. The first day went by like any camping trip. My friend Sam and I set up our tent, gathered wood for a fire, and hiked a few trails. As the sun dipped below the dense line of trees, a creeping cold settled over the forest, like it was trying to push us out. We shrugged it off, telling ourselves it was just the chill of autumn. But as night fell, the forest seemed to grow unnervingly quiet. Not the usual peaceful quiet of nature, but a hollow, pressing silence that made my skin crawl. Around midnight, we heard the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, approaching our camp. We exchanged a glance, the unspoken question hanging between us: who else would be out here? A few moments later, a man in a park ranger uniform emerged from the shadows. He looked weathered, as if he had spent far too long in the forest. His face was oddly expressionless, his eyes dull, like they'd seen something they shouldn't have. "Evening, campers," he greeted, his voice flat and lifeless. "You shouldn't be out here at night. Strange things happen in Blackwood after dark." He warned us about a local legend, something about skinwalkers, creatures that could mimic the appearance and voices of others, but who were far from human. As he spoke, I noticed his hand trembling slightly, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple despite the cold. When I asked him about the trails, his eyes shifted over my shoulder, as if he were looking at something in the dark. Without another word, he turned and disappeared back into the trees, leaving us alone with the oppressive silence. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear whispers, like voices carried on the wind. Sam was restless too. I could hear him tossing and turning in his sleeping bag. I was just about to tell him to get some sleep when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling our tent. "Sam," I whispered, but there was no answer. I crawled out of the tent, shining my flashlight into the darkness, and nearly stumbled over my own feet when I saw him standing there. Sam, but not quite. His face was stretched into a grotesque smile, his eyes wide and unblinking. He didn't speak, just stood there, swaying slightly, that terrible grin fixed on his face. I backed away, my heart pounding, until I tripped over a root and fell. When I looked up, he was gone. I scrambled back into the tent only to find Sam inside, asleep, exactly where I'd left him. I shook him awake, my hands trembling. There was someone outside. He looked like you, Sam, but not right. Something was wrong with him. Sam looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but I could tell he was scared too. We decided to pack up and leave at first light, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched. As dawn broke, we heard it again, a low, guttural growl echoing through the trees. Sam and I froze, listening as it grew louder, closer. And then we saw it. A creature, hunched and monstrous, stalking us from a distance. It was like a wolf, but with impossibly long limbs and eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. Panicked, we ran, branches clawing at us as we tore through the underbrush. I glanced back only to see that the creature was gone, replaced by the ranger we'd seen the night before. He was just standing there, watching us with that same vacant expression. "Did you see that?" I gasped, but Sam looked at me in confusion. "There's no one there," he said. "Are you sure you're okay?" I looked back, and the ranger had vanished. Just trees, silent and foreboding. We made it back to the main trail, our car mercifully in sight. But as I fumbled with the keys, something caught my eye. There in the rearview mirror was the ranger, watching us with that eerie blank stare. Only this time his face began to change, twisting and warping until it looked like mine. A sick, distorted mirror image of my own terrified face. We drove away, our minds racing, desperately trying to make sense of what we'd seen. As we left Blackwood Forest, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The ranger, the creatures, they hadn't wanted to hurt us. They just wanted us to leave, to get away before something even worse found us. But the worst part was when I finally checked my phone for service again. I had a voicemail from an unknown number, time-stamped just before we left. It was Sam's voice, but choked with fear, whispering, "They're in the woods. They can look like us. Don't trust what you see." When I glanced over at Sam in the passenger seat, he gave me a smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. I could feel the dread clawing at my gut as he turned to look at me, his gaze cold and unblinking. It wasn't Sam who came back with me from Blackwood Forest. I never believed in the old legends, not until that night in the heart of Blackwood National Park. As a seasoned park ranger, I had heard plenty of stories, tales passed down by the local tribes, whispered among the veteran rangers during late-night shifts. Skinwalkers, they'd say, shapeshifters, creatures that could mimic the voices of those you knew, lure you deeper into the woods, and steal your soul. I always chalked it up to superstition. That was before I found myself on the midnight shift in the middle of October, patrolling an isolated section of the park near Blackwood Ridge. The area was known for its dense trees, jagged cliffs, and an overwhelming sense of desolation. It had been closed off to the public for months due to unexplained disappearances and sightings of strange creatures. The locals were adamant. There was something evil in those woods. The Park Service wrote it off as wild animals or people getting lost, but I had a different task that night: investigate the latest report of strange noises. The night was cold, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like you'll never be warm again. My flashlight cut through the dark as I trudged along the barely visible trail. The only sound was the crunch of dead leaves underfoot, and even that felt muffled by the oppressive silence. The forest was still, too still, as if the entire place was holding its breath. It didn't take long before I heard the first sign of trouble. A voice, faint and distant, called out from the trees. "Help, someone, please!" I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding. It was a woman's voice, desperate, pleading. My instinct was to rush toward it, but something held me back. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. The area was closed to visitors, and I hadn't seen any cars or signs of campers all evening. My grip tightened on the flashlight. "Help me!" The voice came again, this time closer. I hesitated. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to turn back, to get out of there. But I couldn't ignore the possibility that someone was actually in trouble. I took a deep breath and called out. "Hello, where are you?" There was no response, just the eerie rustle of leaves in the wind. I took a few cautious steps forward, scanning the trees. My flashlight beam bounced off the twisted branches, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. Then I saw her, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the trail. She was barely visible, her form half hidden behind a tree. Her hair was wild, her clothes torn, and her face— something was wrong with her face. It was pale, unnaturally so, almost as if it didn't belong to her. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Help me." I stepped closer, but something inside me, a deep, primal instinct, screamed that this wasn't right. There was something off about the way she moved, the way her body seemed to jerk unnaturally as she stepped forward, just out of the light's reach. "Are you hurt?" I asked, my voice shaky. She didn't answer. Instead, she took another step toward me, her head tilting at an odd angle. And then, in the stillness of the night, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of bones cracking, followed by a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from deep within her throat. My blood turned to ice. Suddenly she lunged toward me, but it wasn't human anymore. The woman's form twisted grotesquely, her limbs elongating, her skin darkening and stretching, as her face contorted into something monstrous. The creature, no longer a woman, let out a sound somewhere between a scream and a snarl. It moved with an unnatural speed, and I stumbled back, barely able to react. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second I saw it in its full form. A gaunt, hairless figure with hollow black eyes and a wide, tooth-filled grin that stretched far beyond the limits of any human mouth. Its skin was taut, leathery, and it reeked of death. I bolted, crashing through the underbrush, my lungs burning as I ran blindly through the dark. Behind me, I could hear the thing crashing after me, its ragged breaths and snarls growing louder, closer. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away. Suddenly, the forest around me seemed to shift, the trees closing in as if they were conspiring to trap me. I stumbled into a small clearing, panting and desperate, my heart pounding in my ears. The thing was close now. I could feel its presence, smell the rot on its breath. I spun around, expecting it to be right behind me. But it wasn't there. The clearing was empty. For a moment, I thought I had outrun it. My body trembled with exhaustion, but I kept scanning the trees, waiting for the creature to reappear. That's when I heard something worse. A voice. My voice. "Ranger Evans?" It called out from the trees, perfectly mimicking the sound of my own voice, as though I were standing just behind the next tree. "Where are you?" I froze. My own voice echoed back at me again, calling for me. "Over here." Then came another voice, one I recognized immediately, my supervisor's. "Evans, are you out here? We're looking for you." My heart thudded in my chest. I knew it wasn't real. They weren't real. But the voices kept coming, perfectly imitating everyone I knew. First my supervisor, then my father, then my sister. All calling for me, pleading for me to come to them, to step deeper into the woods. I fell to my knees, covering my ears, trying to drown out the voices. But they grew louder, more insistent. And then, in the midst of all the confusion, the whispering started. A low, raspy chant, in a language I couldn't understand but somehow felt deep in my bones. The SKINWALKER was playing with me. I fumbled for my radio, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I pressed the button, my voice barely a whisper. "Base, this is Evans. Do you copy?" For a long moment, there was nothing but static. Then, a voice crackled through. "Evans? Where the hell are you?" I nearly cried with relief. It was my supervisor's voice, but this time it sounded real. I'm near Blackwood Ridge. Something's out here. The radio cut off with a screech of static, followed by a single phrase spoken in my own voice. "You can't escape." I dropped the radio and stumbled to my feet, ready to run again. But as I turned, the skinwalker stepped into the clearing, its grotesque grin widening, and then everything went black. I woke up at dawn lying on the edge of the trail. My flashlight was dead and my radio was gone. I was alone and the forest was silent again, but I knew I wasn't safe. I could still feel it, watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to make a mistake. I left Blackwood that morning and never went back, but even now I can hear the whispers sometimes, just beyond the edge of my hearing, calling for me in voices I recognize. I know it's still out there and it knows I survived. I had been hiking for days, a solo trip through the vast wilderness of the Appalachian forests. The isolation was intoxicating. No phone signal, no human voices, just the trees and the wind whispering through the branches. It was a perfect escape, or at least, that's what I told myself. But on the third night, something changed. I'd found a small clearing by a creek, ideal for setting up camp. The air was crisp, with just a hint of the chill that signaled autumn's approach. I built a fire, cooked some instant noodles, and watched the stars blink into view as the last light of day faded away. There was a peace in that darkness, the kind you don't find anywhere else. But then I heard a sound. It was faint at first, a distant cry that almost sounded human. I froze, listening. Again it came, echoing through the trees, this time closer, like someone calling for help. I tried to shake off the unease creeping into my bones. Maybe it was just an animal, I thought, or a trick of the wind. But I couldn't shake the sense that it sounded too much like a voice. "Hello?" I called into the darkness, hoping for some kind of response. But the forest swallowed my words. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, and then I heard it again, a low, guttural growl, followed by another cry. This time it was much closer. I flicked on my flashlight and swept it over the trees, catching glimpses of shadows that seemed to move just outside the beam of light. My heart hammered in my chest as I stood there, straining to hear any other sounds. But the forest had gone silent. Too silent. I backed up to the fire, instinctively seeking the warmth and light. That's when I noticed something strange. The trees around the clearing seemed darker, like they were closing in, and the shadows were deeper, almost unnaturally so. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the fear playing tricks on me. But then, from the darkness, I saw them. 2 glowing eyes, fixed on me, unblinking. I stumbled back, tripping over my gear as I scrambled to my feet. The eyes didn't move, just stared, cold and unfeeling, as if studying me. Then, out of the darkness, a figure stepped forward. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was wearing a park ranger uniform, but there was something wrong about him. His limbs were stiff, his movements unnatural, and his face was twisted into a smile that was far too wide, almost splitting his face in two. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice low and flat, without a hint of warmth. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. I didn't trust him. Something about him felt wrong, like he was wearing a mask that didn't quite fit. I took a step back, and that's when I noticed the smell. It was a putrid, decaying stench that made my stomach turn, like something rotting beneath the earth. "Need some help finding your way?" he asked, that same unsettling smile never fading. I shook my head, finally managing to force out a response. "No, I'm fine. I was just about to turn in for the night." His expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to glint with something sinister. "Be careful out here. These woods, they're full of things you wouldn't understand." With that, he turned and walked back into the trees, his figure disappearing into the shadows like he'd never been there at all. I stood there, frozen, listening to the silence that followed. The fire crackled, and I watched as the darkness seemed to swallow the light around me. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel something watching me, lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. The noises started again, soft at first. A distant howl, the snap of twigs, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground. I kept the fire burning until dawn, barely moving, barely breathing, afraid that any sound I made would draw whatever it was closer. As the first light of day broke through the trees, I packed up my things and started hiking back the way I'd come. I didn't care about the path, didn't care that I was going off course. I just needed to get out, away from whatever was lurking in those woods. But as I walked, I started to notice something strange. The trees around me seemed familiar, as if I was going in circles. And then, through a gap in the trees, I saw the same creek, the same clearing. I was back at my campsite. I stopped, panic rising in my chest as I realized I'd been walking for hours, yet I hadn't gone anywhere. The sun was still low in the sky, and a chill ran down my spine as I looked around, desperate to find a way out. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and that's when I saw him again. The ranger was standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me with those cold, unblinking eyes. He didn't smile this time, just stared, his face expressionless. I felt a surge of anger, of fear, as I demanded to know what was going on. "You'll never leave," he said, his voice echoing through the trees. "Not unless they let you." "They?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Who are they?" He didn't answer, just stepped back into the shadows, and that's when I saw them, shapes moving in the darkness, shifting and writhing, their eyes glowing like embers. They looked like people, but their faces were wrong, twisted and distorted, as if they'd been molded from clay and left to melt in the sun. I turned and ran, not caring which direction I went, just needing to escape. But no matter how far I ran, I kept finding myself back at the clearing, back by the creek, the same trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. It felt like days passed, though the sun never seemed to rise higher than just above the trees. And the ranger was always there, watching, waiting, as if he was part of the forest itself. I screamed, begged, pleaded, but there was no one to hear. The shadows grew longer, the trees seeming to twist and contort around me, closing me in, until finally I collapsed by the fire, too exhausted to move. As the darkness swallowed me, I heard the ranger's voice one last time, a whisper carried on the wind. "You're one of them now." I woke up the next morning, lying by the creek, the fire long dead. The forest was silent, but different now. It was as if I could feel it breathing, pulsing around me. I stumbled to my feet, my body aching, my mind hazy, and that's when I realized I could see everything. Every leaf, every blade of grass, every shadow stretching across the ground. It was like I was a part of the forest, and it was a part of me. I walked to the edge of the clearing and saw my reflection in the creek. My face was pale, my eyes empty, hollow, like I'd been drained of everything that made me human. I knew somehow that I'd never leave that forest. Not really. I was just another shadow now, another echo in the trees, waiting for the next unlucky soul to wander too deep into the woods. So if you ever find yourself camping out here, if you hear a voice in the darkness, or see a figure just beyond the light, be careful. Because once you're in these woods, you may never find your way out. And if you do, you won't be the same. You'll be like me, a part of the forest, forever watching, forever waiting. I'd heard the rumors about ember pines for years, strange lights, unnatural sounds, people who vanished without a trace. They said the woods were haunted, cursed, or worse. But that only made me more curious. My brother Sam and I had been into cryptids and ghost stories since we were kids, so when he suggested we camp there, I jumped at the chance. I didn't realize that the stories weren't just legends, and that what waited for us in those woods was beyond anything we could have imagined. We set up camp at the edge of the forest, right near an old trail that hadn't been used in decades. The place was eerily quiet, No sounds of birds or insects, just an overwhelming silence that pressed in around us. We tried to laugh it off, telling ourselves it was just because the forest was so remote. As we settled in, I noticed a strange carving on a tree nearby. It looked like an eye, with 3 lines extending from it almost like it was crying. Sam, always the skeptic, shrugged it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The first night was uneventful, but the second night was when things started getting weird. Around midnight, a low hum echoed through the woods, vibrating through the ground like a heartbeat. I sat up, trying to pinpoint the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sam woke up too, wide-eyed, and we exchanged a look, neither of us saying a word. Then we saw it. A faint light flickering through the trees, moving erratically, almost like it was searching for something. We grabbed our flashlights and decided to follow it, curiosity getting the better of us. The light led us deeper into the woods, weaving through the trees with a strange, hypnotic rhythm. I felt like I was in a trance, my feet moving almost against my will. After a while, we came to a small clearing, and there in the center stood a cabin. It was old, half-collapsed, with the roof caved in and the windows shattered. But what caught my attention was the smell, like rotting meat and sulfur, so thick it made my eyes water. We should have turned back, but Sam was already pushing the door open, his flashlight sweeping across the dusty interior. The walls were covered in strange symbols carved deep into the wood, and on the floor were bones scattered in haphazard piles. They looked like animal bones, but some of them seemed larger, almost human. Then we heard it, footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, crunching over the fallen leaves. I grabbed Sam's arm, and we both froze, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps circled the cabin, pausing now and then as if whoever or whatever it was could sense our fear. Suddenly the door creaked open wider, and in stepped a figure. He was wearing a park ranger's uniform, but it was tattered, filthy, and hanging off him like it didn't quite fit. His skin was pallid, almost translucent, and his eyes, they were a deep, unsettling yellow, glowing faintly in the darkness. "Evening," he drawled, his voice thick and raspy like he hadn't used it in years. "You boys lost?" I wanted to speak, but my throat was dry and my body felt paralyzed. Sam managed to stammer out, "We're just camping. We didn't mean to trespass." The ranger tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as he looked us over. "Trespassing, huh? This here's a special place. People come here to forget, or to be forgotten." He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on me now, and I felt a chill settle over me, colder than any winter night. "Once you step into these woods," he continued, "they claim you. I reckon it's too late for you now." Without another word, he turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the shadows like he'd never been there at all. Sam and I bolted, running back toward the campsite as fast as we could, our flashlights bouncing wildly in the darkness. But when we reached the spot where we'd set up camp, it was gone. The tent, the fire pit, our gear, everything was missing, as if we'd never been there. I looked around, trying to find any sign that we were in the right place, but all I saw were trees, stretching endlessly in every direction. The woods were different now, twisted and foreign. Trees seemed to loom over us, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. I could feel eyes on us, watching from the shadows, and strange sounds filled the air. Whispers, laughter, things moving just beyond the reach of our lights. We wandered for hours, or maybe it was minutes, it was impossible to tell. The woods seemed to twist around us, every path leading us back to the same spot, the clearing with that damned cabin, and each time we returned it looked a little different, older, more decayed, like it was feeding off our fear. Finally we heard voices, familiar ones. They were calling our names, echoing through the trees, coming from every direction at once. They sounded like our friends, our family, but distorted, stretched out like they were speaking underwater. Sam began to shout back, but I grabbed his arm, pulling him away. "Those aren't real," I hissed, but I wasn't even sure I believed it. "They're trying to lure us in." We stumbled onward, driven by sheer desperation, until we finally burst out onto a trail. I don't know how we found it, but we ran, not stopping until we reached the edge of the woods and collapsed near the road. Only then did we look back, and in the distance, just beyond the tree line, we saw the ranger again, his yellow eyes watching us, a grim smile on his face. He lifted a hand in a slow wave before vanishing back into the trees. We never found our gear, and no one believed our story. But as we left Ember Pines, I couldn't shake the feeling that a part of us had stayed behind, claimed by the forest. Even now, I sometimes hear those voices in my dreams calling me back to the woods, and I know that if I ever return, I won't make it out again. I had always been fascinated by Cold Hollow. It's a remote section of forest where the trees are so dense they blot out the sun, and a heavy fog lingers all year round. Local legends call it cursed, but I didn't buy into that. I'm a park ranger, not some superstitious fool. So when I was assigned to patrol Cold Hollow, I took it as a challenge, a chance to prove the tales wrong. It was autumn when I went out there, the air thick with the scent of wet leaves and pine. The first few days were uneventful. I'd spend my nights in the old ranger's cabin, a crumbling relic of a building that stood in a small clearing just inside the woods. At night, I'd hear animals rustling, maybe the odd owl hooting, but nothing unusual. That was until the third night. I was lying in bed, drifting off, when I heard something out in the woods, something big, crunching through the underbrush. I sat up, reaching for my flashlight. The noise stopped, but I could still feel its presence as if it were just outside, watching. I waited, heart pounding, until the silence returned. I didn't sleep much after that. The next day I found strange tracks around the cabin, massive paw prints with elongated claws like nothing I'd ever seen before. They led off into the woods, and for a moment I considered following them. But something deep inside me warned against it, a primal fear that I hadn't felt since I was a kid. That night I heard the footsteps again. This time they circled the cabin, slow and deliberate, as if whatever it was knew I was inside. I lay still, barely breathing, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. And then I heard it, a whisper, soft and slithering, winding its way through the walls of the cabin. It was like the wind, only it carried words. "Come out, we're waiting." I sprang out of bed, throwing open the door and shining my light into the trees. But there was nothing, only shadows and fog. I told myself it was my imagination, the product of too many ghost stories and a lack of sleep. But the feeling of being watched never left me. Over the next few days, the occurrences became more frequent, more intense. I'd catch glimpses of shapes in the mist, tall, spindly figures that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. I'd find dead animals, twisted and broken, their eyes gouged out, lying on my doorstep as if left there as offerings. And always I felt the presence, an unseen gaze that followed me wherever I went. One afternoon, as I was checking a remote part of the forest, I stumbled upon an old stone circle, partially buried in the undergrowth. I'd never seen it on any maps, and there was no record of it in the ranger's logs. It looked ancient, the stones covered in moss and strange markings that sent a chill down my spine. In the center was a crude statue, carved from stone, resembling a creature with a long, twisted neck and empty sockets where eyes should be. Something about it felt wrong, as if it didn't belong in this world. I was about to leave when I noticed something odd about the trees surrounding the circle. They were lined with scratches, deep grooves that formed strange symbols, almost like some kind of language. I traced my fingers over one of them and immediately felt a jolt, like static electricity. I stumbled back, the world spinning, and in that moment, I felt the presence again, closer, more oppressive than ever. I staggered back to the cabin, my mind racing. The whispers had returned, only now they were louder, echoing in my head even when I covered my ears. I thought about leaving, but I knew that whatever was out there wouldn't let me go so easily. It wanted something from me, and deep down I was beginning to understand. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, flashlight in hand, watching the edge of the woods. As dawn approached, I saw them. 3 figures standing just inside the tree line, watching me with hollow, empty eyes. They were tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally, their faces blank except for wide, gaping mouths. They began to move, drifting towards the cabin without a sound, gliding over the ground like ghosts. I bolted the door, but I knew it wouldn't stop them. I could hear them, their voices now a cacophony, each one layering over the other until it became a single droning chant. I don't remember much after that. I woke up the next morning, slumped in a corner, the cabin door wide open. The stone circle had burned itself into my mind, the twisted statue haunting me even in my waking hours. I knew then what they wanted, why they'd been watching me. The woods had chosen me, marked me as theirs. I was not just a visitor. I was the next watcher. I left Cold Hollow that day, but the feeling of being watched has never left me. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I see the twisted figures waiting in the fog, hear their whispers crawling through the trees. I know they're still out there, and that one day they'll call me back, because once you've seen the Watchers of Cold Hollow, you never truly leave. And now, as I sit here writing this, I can feel them again, just beyond the edge of the light, waiting patiently, knowing that someday soon, I'll return to the woods that have claimed my soul. I still regret agreeing to that camping trip. My best friend Jake and I had been planning it for months, a weekend away from the chaos of city life, deep in the remote woods of Blackthorn National Park. The place had always been rumored to be a hot spot for strange sightings, but we didn't put much stock in the stories. In hindsight, we probably should have listened. It started off normal enough. We parked the car at the edge of the woods and hiked about 5 miles in, far from the main trails, setting up our tent beside a shallow creek. The forest was thick and quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making your ears strain for any sound. Even Jake, who was usually all jokes and bravado, seemed a bit subdued. The first night, as we sat around the fire, we heard a low, rustling sound from somewhere in the trees. I shrugged it off as an animal, but Jake's face had gone pale and he whispered, "Did you hear that?" I laughed, but my voice wavered. There was something about that sound, slow, deliberate, like footsteps that stopped as soon as you listened too hard. We passed it off as paranoia, but that night, sleep didn't come easily. The next morning we met him, the park ranger. We were packing up to go explore the area when he appeared seemingly out of nowhere. He was tall, with a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face, and his uniform looked off, like it didn't quite fit him. His skin was almost gray, like he'd been sick for a long time, and his eyes, when he looked at us, were the darkest brown I'd ever seen. He didn't blink. "Everything okay, boys?" His voice was gravelly, and he lingered on the last word, stretching it out until it was almost a hiss. "We're fine," I replied, but Jake stepped back, clearly uneasy. The ranger kept staring, his eyes never leaving us. "You're not supposed to be this far out," he said, a crooked grin forming on his face. "This part of the park, it's not safe after dark." He didn't elaborate, just held our gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then turned and disappeared back into the trees without another word. I can't explain it, but something about him felt wrong, like he wasn't entirely human. As the day wore on, the sense of being watched only grew stronger. I kept seeing flashes of movement in the corner of my eye, shadows darting between the trees, shapes that vanished as soon as I turned to look. Every now and then I'd hear something, a low growl or the snap of a branch too loud to be just animals. I tried to brush it off, but I could tell Jake felt it too. By dusk, the forest felt suffocating, like the trees were pressing in closer, their branches clawing at the sky. We decided to head back to the tent, but as we neared the creek, we noticed something strange. The campsite was littered with footprints, odd ones, too large to be a person's, yet too human to be an animal. Some prints had toes, but others were just elongated, like stretched-out hands. That night the sounds grew worse. Around midnight, a low guttural howl echoed through the woods, sending a chill down my spine. I could hear Jake breathing heavily beside me, clutching his flashlight like a lifeline. And then we heard it, the voice. It was coming from outside the tent, a low, distorted whisper, repeating our names over and over. At first I thought it was the ranger, but the voice was wrong, too shrill, like nails on a chalkboard. "Jake, Danny, come out and play." I held my breath, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. It was circling the tent now, the voice growing louder, more insistent. I felt paralyzed, unable to move, when suddenly the tent shook violently, as if something massive had slammed into it. We both scrambled to our feet, clutching the fabric, but whatever was out there kept circling, clawing at the sides. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. Silence fell, thick and oppressive, broken only by our ragged breathing. I whispered to Jake that we needed to make a run for it, but before we could move, we heard the footsteps again. This time they were slow, heavy, like someone was dragging something behind them. I peeked through a small gap in the tent and saw it, a figure standing in the clearing, silhouetted by the moonlight. It was tall, almost impossibly so, and covered in matted fur. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its face, I don't even know how to describe it. It looked almost human, but twisted, elongated, like someone had tried to stretch a person into the shape of an animal. Beside it, I saw the ranger, his face slack and empty, staring right at us with those dark, lifeless eyes. He held a hand out to the creature, almost like he was commanding it. Jake and I bolted. We didn't bother packing anything, just grabbed our flashlights and ran as fast as we could, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes and skin. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear them behind us, crashing through the forest, getting closer. By the time we made it to the car, we were both a mess, bloodied and out of breath. I fumbled with the keys, and as I glanced back, I saw them standing at the edge of the tree line, watching us. The ranger raised a hand in a mock salute, and beside him that creature snarled, its eyes locked on me, filled with something that looked disturbingly like hunger. We drove for hours, not stopping until we were far, far away from those woods. When we finally reached a gas station, we tried to tell the attendant about what we'd seen, but he just shook his head. "You boys were lucky," he said, his voice low. "People go missing up there all the time. They say something in those woods, something that likes to play with its food." I never saw Jake again after that trip. He moved away, changed his number, cut all ties. Sometimes I wonder if he knew something I didn't, if he'd heard that voice calling to him in the night and decided he'd rather forget. As for me, I still dream about those woods, about the ranger's empty eyes and the creature lurking in the shadows. And sometimes in the dead of night, I hear that voice again, whispering my name, calling me back to play. They call it the silent stretch, a part of the forest where the usual sounds of nature just stop. No birds, no insects, not even the wind. It was my job to patrol it, the deepest, most isolated area of Red Ridge Forest, where sunlight barely penetrates the thick canopy. They sent me there because I was new, and the veterans wanted to scare me. They said no one lasted long in the silent stretch. I should have listened. The first few nights were uneventful, just an unsettling quiet. But on the fourth night, I found something strange. A crudely carved wooden figure nailed to a tree. It was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were elongated, twisted at odd angles, and its face had no features, just a blank, smooth surface. I took it down and brought it back to the station, where it sat on my desk, a curious artifact. But as soon as I removed that figure, strange things began happening. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, hearing faint footsteps outside my cabin, stopping just short of the door. And when I'd check, there was no one there, just a chill in the air that clung to my skin. At first, I thought it was a prank, a cruel initiation by the other rangers. But it didn't stop, and the noises grew louder, closer. One evening, as I patrolled deeper into the woods, I noticed something moving among the trees. At first, I thought it was a deer, but then I saw its eyes. They glowed a pale, sickly white, too high off the ground to belong to any animal I knew. I shone my flashlight in its direction, and it ducked behind a tree, fast and silent. I only caught a glimpse, but it was enough to make my stomach drop. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch on forever. And those eyes, those empty, piercing eyes, felt like they were seeing straight through me. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was a trick of the light, that my mind was playing games. But when I returned to the station, I found a new figure nailed to the tree just outside my cabin. It looked like the one I had removed, but this time the figure had crude, gouged-out eyes, hollow and black. I didn't touch it. I didn't dare. That night the footsteps returned, but now they weren't just outside. I heard them inside my cabin, circling my bed, shuffling across the wooden floor. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel a presence, cold and malevolent, watching me from the shadows. When I finally mustered the courage to turn on the light, the room was empty. But on my desk, where I had left the first figure, I found a new one. This one was smaller, and it looked like me. It was a twisted, disfigured version with gouged-out eyes and limbs bent at unnatural angles. Panicking, I grabbed my flashlight and headed back into the forest, desperate to find answers, desperate to escape the feeling that I was being hunted. The silent stretch was darker than ever, the silence pressing in on me like a weight. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe I was hoping to find that tall figure, to confront it, to end whatever curse I had unleashed by removing that first wooden figure. As I ventured deeper, I saw them, more figures nailed to trees, lined up in a macabre procession. They grew more grotesque the further I went, with twisted limbs and blank, hollow faces. And then, finally, I saw it. In the center of a small clearing beneath a tangle of vines stood a massive tree, its trunk scarred and blackened. Nailed to it was the largest figure yet, nearly as tall as I was, with a face carved into a horrible, screaming expression, and there, standing beside it, was the night watcher. It was even taller up close, its limbs impossibly thin, its skin stretched tight over bone. It moved silently, its joints creaking as it turned its blank, featureless face toward me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped, caught in its gaze, feeling like prey under the eyes of something that didn't belong in this world. The creature reached out a long, bony hand and pointed to the figures on the tree. I understood then they were warnings, boundaries that should never have been crossed, and I had crossed them, trespassed into its domain. I had taken something that didn't belong to me, and now I was paying the price. The night watcher leaned closer, its face inches from mine, and I felt its breath, cold and fetid, as it whispered words that I couldn't understand, but somehow felt deep in my bones. Then just as suddenly it vanished, leaving me alone in the clearing with nothing but the figures and the silence. I don't remember making it back to the station, but I woke up the next morning with a new figure on my desk. It was a perfect likeness of the night watcher, its limbs impossibly long, its face a blank, hollow void. I knew then that it wasn't over. The silent stretch had marked me, claimed me as part of its twisted domain. Now I hear the footsteps every night. They follow me, even when I leave the forest, even when I think I'm safe. I know it's only a matter of time before the night watcher comes to collect me, to add me to its collection of twisted figures nailed to the trees in the heart of the silent stretch. I am one of them now, and I know I can never escape. The forest keeps its secrets, and now I am one of them. If you ever find yourself in the silent stretch, remember, don't touch anything, don't take anything, and whatever you do, don't look back. They called it Dead Man's Hollow. The name alone should have been enough to keep me away, but curiosity got the better of me. As a park ranger, I'd always heard the legends, the whispered tales of people vanishing, of strange lights flickering in the darkness, and of the voices. Most people shrugged them off as campfire stories, but every once in a while someone would return from the hollow with eyes haunted and speech shaken, never quite the same. When I got assigned to investigate reports of strange occurrences there, I tried to laugh it off. but as I headed out that evening, I couldn't shake a gnawing sense of dread. The sun was sinking fast, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges, casting long shadows across the forest floor. It felt like the trees themselves were drawing closer, eager to swallow the light before it disappeared. I followed the narrow, winding path that led into the hollow, where the trees grew thicker and the air grew heavier. As I walked, I started to hear faint sounds, a rustling, a whispering, just at the edge of my hearing. I told myself it was just the wind, but the further I went, the more distinct the whispers became. They were voices, overlapping and murmuring, too many to count. The trail soon opened up into a small clearing, overgrown with thorny brambles and twisted vines. In the center of the clearing stood an old abandoned cabin. I'd seen it on maps, but they always said it was just a ruin, long since collapsed. Now, though, it stood tall, its windows dark and empty, a haunting presence amid the trees. As I stepped closer, the whispers grew louder, almost urgent. They seemed to be calling my name, each syllable drawn out, mocking, as if they knew me. I shivered, gripping my flashlight tightly, and took another step forward. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a sickly sweet odor that clung to my lungs. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon me. I decided to investigate the cabin, hoping to find some explanation for what I was hearing. As I approached the door, it swung open with a groan, revealing a darkness so deep it seemed to swallow my flashlight's beam. I hesitated, but curiosity drove me onward. The inside was musty, filled with shadows that twisted and stretched along the walls. Old furniture lay scattered about, half-rotted and covered in dust. And then I saw it, a journal, lying open on a table in the center of the room. I picked it up, and as I flipped through the brittle pages, a chill ran down my spine. The writing was frantic, scrawled in large looping letters that spoke of encounters with creatures that wore the faces of loved ones and sounds that led travelers astray. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the cabin with a cacophony of voices. I dropped the journal, and it fell open to a page that was smeared with dark stains. Words scrawled hastily across the page. Do not trust their faces. They wear our skins. They know our secrets. Before I could react, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, flashlight at the ready, and saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with eyes that were too wide, too empty. He looked familiar, though I couldn't place him. And then he spoke, in a voice that was almost mine, yet not quite right. "Why are you here?" he asked, his tone slow and distorted, like he was trying out each word for the first time. I couldn't answer, my throat tight with fear. He stepped closer, and I noticed that his skin seemed off, like it didn't quite fit. As he moved, I caught a glimpse of something underneath, something dark and shifting, as if his flesh was just a mask hiding something far more sinister. He reached out a hand, and I saw his fingers were too long, the nails blackened and jagged. I backed away, bumping into the table, and he stopped, tilting his head like a curious animal. And then, as if on cue, more figures appeared in the doorway, each one wearing a face I recognized. There was my old mentor, who had disappeared years ago, and a camper who'd gone missing last summer. They all stared at me, their faces stretched into unnatural smiles. I stumbled backward, desperate to escape, but the cabin felt alive, the walls closing in. The whispers became a roar, drowning out my thoughts, filling my mind with fragments of memory that weren't mine. I could feel them clawing at my sanity, pulling me toward them, toward their hollow, hungry eyes. In a panic, I turned and ran, barreling out of the cabin and into the woods. But the voices followed, echoing around me, filling the air with laughter that sounded too much like my own. The path twisted and turned, and I found myself deeper in the woods, lost among trees that seemed to shift and writhe as I ran. Every shadow felt like a creature, every sound a step closer to whatever waited for me in the darkness. Just when I thought I couldn't run any longer, I burst into another clearing, but this time, There was no escape. The figures stood all around me, their eyes gleaming, their faces stretched and wrong, and among them I saw myself, my own face, hollow and empty, staring back with a smile that wasn't mine. They spoke in unison, their voices a chilling chorus. "You cannot leave. You are one of us now." I screamed and the world faded to black. When I woke, I was back at the station with no memory of how I returned. They say I must have hit my head, that I must have been hallucinating. But every time I close my eyes, I see their faces, feel their eyes upon me. I know they're still out there waiting for me in Deadman's Hollow, where the voices never die. And sometimes late at night I hear them calling, pulling me back, their whispers wrapping around my mind like vines, dragging me closer to the shadows that never let go. The forest doesn't forget. It waits. And one day, I know I'll answer its call. I took the ranger job in the vast, dense woods of Blackstone Forest for solitude. The days were quiet, mostly, patrolling trails, checking campgrounds, and the occasional warning to hikers who wandered too far off the beaten path. But when the sun dipped below the jagged tree line, a different world seemed to awaken. I'd heard stories, locals whispering about strange shapes that slinked between the trees and sounds that didn't belong to any animal they knew. I'd always brushed them off. At least I did until that night. It was a late autumn evening and a biting wind howled through the forest as I started my shift. I'd been asked to check on a campsite deep within the woods, where campers had reported strange noises the previous night. They said something large had been pacing around their tent, growling, a low, guttural rumble that didn't sound like any animal they could identify. The campers had packed up and left at dawn, refusing to spend another night out there. But someone had to go investigate, and it fell to me. The hike was long and tedious, with an eerie silence pressing in the further I went. The air felt thick, as if the trees themselves were watching. As I neared the campsite, a peculiar odor reached me, something metallic and rotting. I almost turned back, but the sense of duty kept me moving. When I arrived, the campsite was exactly as they'd described. 2 tents, a fire pit with half-burned logs, and a mess of scattered belongings. It was as if they had left in a hurry. As I circled the site, I noticed something odd. Large clawed footprints were imprinted in the mud, leading from the edge of the camp into the dense woods. They were too big to belong to any bear, and the spacing was unnatural, almost as if whatever had made them was walking upright. I followed the tracks with a flashlight, each step feeling heavier than the last. The further I went, the more twisted and gnarled the trees became, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. A low rustling filled the air, and I froze. Ahead, something moved, something large, hunched and covered in matted fur. It had the face of a dog, but the body of a man, with limbs that seemed too long, joints bending in unnatural ways. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The creature stared at me, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow. Then it let out a sound that wasn't quite a growl, but more of a distorted mimicry of a human scream. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight, and then the thing turned and disappeared into the shadows, moving with an unnatural, bone-snapping speed. I should have run back to the station. I should have left right then and there, but something compelled me to keep going. It was like I was being drawn deeper, as if the forest itself wanted me to see more. The tracks were joined by others now, long slithering trails that suggested something massive and serpent-like had passed through, alongside prints that looked eerily human, but too large and too misshapen. As I continued, the noises around me grew louder, strange whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, the snapping of branches far too close, and that same metallic smell growing stronger. I knew I wasn't alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just one creature stalking me. It was many. Finally, I came upon a clearing, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. In the center stood a circle of crudely made totems, carved from twisted branches and bones. Each totem had a face, some animalistic, others almost human, but all bearing that same disturbing, hollow-eyed gaze. And at the base of each totem were piles of offerings, old clothes, personal belongings, photographs that looked faded and worn, as if they'd been left there for years. Among them I noticed a nameplate from a ranger uniform, cracked and barely legible. I stumbled back, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. I knew that name. He was a ranger who had gone missing 5 years ago, one of the many mysterious disappearances that the station hushed up with half-hearted explanations and paperwork. I glanced at the other objects and recognized more pieces, things that belonged to the other campers who had vanished over the years. Then, just as my mind began to piece together the horrific truth, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Why are you here?" it asked, but it was my own voice. I spun around only to see myself standing there, a perfect mirror image. But there was something wrong with it. My face was twisted, eyes empty and soulless. It smiled, revealing rows of unnaturally sharp teeth. Panic surged through me as I backed away, stumbling over roots and rocks. The other creatures emerged from the trees, their forms shifting, some half-human, others with features that defied all logic. They encircled me, and I could feel their hunger, their eyes boring into my soul. My doppelganger stepped closer, reaching out with a hand that seemed to melt and reform with every step. "You're one of us now," it whispered, and I could feel a dark, invasive presence burrowing into my mind, twisting my thoughts, distorting my sense of reality. I don't remember how I made it back to the station. I just remember the sunrise breaking over the tree line as I stumbled through the door, covered in mud and blood. They found me rambling, clutching at my head, muttering about totems and shadows. They say I was hallucinating, that I spent the night out there lost and alone. But I know what I saw. And now, when I look in the mirror, I don't always recognize the face staring back at me. Every night since then I hear it, the whispering from the woods, calling me back, luring me into the darkness. And some nights when the forest is quiet, I swear I can see shadows at the edge of the trees, watching and waiting for me to return. Because I know the truth now, once you enter Blackstone Forest, a part of you never really leaves. The forest waits, it remembers, and it claims those who dare to uncover its secrets. I never liked camping alone, but when I got the opportunity to take a few days off, I decided to head out to Hollow Creek. It was a hidden gem, nestled deep in the mountains and known for its untouched beauty. The only catch was that it was so remote you had to hike nearly 7 miles to reach it. I'd read stories about strange encounters out there, but I thought they were just tall tales to keep people from wandering too far into the wilderness. The hike in was peaceful. Birds chirped, the sun filtered through the dense canopy, and the air was fresh and cool. By the time I reached the campsite, it was already late afternoon, so I quickly set up my tent near the water and gathered some firewood. The park was deserted, no other campers, no signs of anyone. I thought I'd have the whole place to myself. That evening, as I was starting a fire, I heard someone approaching. I turned to see a man in a ranger's uniform, tall and thin, with a graying beard and sunken eyes that seemed almost hollow. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Didn't expect to see anyone else out here," I said, trying to sound friendly. He didn't respond right away, just stared at me, his eyes scanning over my campsite like he was inspecting it. Finally he spoke, his voice low and hoarse. "You know, folks don't usually come out to Hollow Creek alone. Not safe this time of year." I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the chill that ran down my spine. "I'm just here for a couple of nights. Thought I'd enjoy some peace and quiet." The ranger's gaze never wavered, his eyes unsettlingly dark. Quiet, maybe. Peaceful? Not so much. He glanced at the woods behind me, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. "You stick close to your fire, all right? And if you hear something, don't go looking." Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and disappeared into the trees, moving so quietly it was like he'd never been there at all. I shook it off, chalking it up to him trying to scare me. Maybe he thought I was another clueless hiker, and he just wanted to spook me into leaving. But his words lingered, casting a shadow over my excitement. As night fell, the forest around me seemed to grow darker than it should have. The fire flickered weakly, barely keeping the cold at bay, and every snap of a twig or rustle in the bushes made me jump. At first I tried to tell myself it was just animals, maybe deer or raccoons moving through the underbrush. But then I started to hear something else. A low, guttural growl, too deep to be any normal animal, echoed through the trees. I tried to peer into the darkness, but my flashlight barely cut through the night. I strained my ears, hoping I was imagining things, but then it came again, closer this time and followed by a strange shuffling sound, like something dragging itself through the leaves. I backed up towards the fire, my eyes darting around, heart pounding, and then I saw it. Just beyond the edge of the firelight, two glinting eyes stared back at me, low to the ground and far too close together. It looked like a dog, but wrong. Its body was twisted, with limbs that were too long, and it moved with a sickly, jerky motion, almost like it was trying to walk on two legs but couldn't quite manage it. I grabbed a log from the fire, holding it out like a torch, but the creature didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, and then it opened its mouth and let out a low, rasping growl that made my skin crawl. I could smell it now, a foul, rotting stench that turned my stomach, and then, behind it, I saw movement. More eyes. Another figure stepped into the faint light, tall and gaunt, with matted fur and a face that seemed to shift and change, never settling into a single shape. It looked like a person, but its eyes were all wrong, empty and black, like holes drilled into its skull. I stumbled back, tripping over my gear, and the creatures didn't follow. They just watched, those empty eyes unblinking, almost curious. And then, as if on cue, they both turned and vanished into the darkness, moving faster than seemed possible. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, gripping my makeshift torch, waiting for the first light of dawn. I thought of the ranger's warning, wondering if he'd seen them too, if he knew what was out here in the woods. As the first rays of sunlight finally broke through the trees, I packed up my things and prepared to leave, ready to put as much distance between me and Hollow Creek as possible. But as I slung my backpack over my shoulder, I saw him again. The ranger. He stood at the edge of the clearing watching me, a faint smile on his face. This time, I noticed something strange. His eyes, which I'd thought were just dark, now seemed as empty and black as those creatures' eyes, like twin voids that swallowed the light. He didn't say a word, just nodded and turned away, disappearing into the woods as silently as he'd arrived. I didn't waste a second. I sprinted back down the trail, not stopping until I reached my car. I'd been back home for days before I dared to look up anything about Hollow Creek. The last recorded ranger in the area? He'd disappeared 20 years ago, last seen on a routine patrol near Hollow Creek. He'd never been found. I still don't know what I saw out there. Maybe he was warning me, maybe he was something else entirely. But sometimes in the dead of night I think I can hear that growl again, faint and far away, like it's calling me back to the woods, and I know that if I ever go back I won't make it out again. I always loved camping. There's a peace in the wilderness that you can't find anywhere else. That's why I was out there, deep in the woods, miles away from civilization. Just me, a tent, a small fire, and the forest. I was supposed to meet up with some friends that evening, but they hadn't shown up. I told myself they were just running late, and it wasn't the first time I'd camped solo. I wasn't worried. As the sun set, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was quiet. Too quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, just a heavy, suffocating silence. I shrugged it off as my imagination running wild, but that's when I heard the first noise. It was like a low growl, deep and guttural, echoing from somewhere in the distance. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just some animal prowling around, but the growl had an edge to it, something that made my skin crawl. I kept the fire burning brighter and tried to focus on the flames, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift around me, creeping closer with each passing minute. I told myself to calm down, but then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far heavier than any animal I knew. I called out, thinking maybe my friends had finally arrived, but there was no answer. The footsteps stopped, and then silence. That's when I saw him. A park ranger. His uniform looked right, but something about him didn't. His eyes were wrong. They were wide, almost too wide, and they reflected the firelight in an unsettling way. He stood just outside the ring of light, his face barely visible, and when he spoke, his voice was hollow, like he was speaking from somewhere far away. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his gaze piercing through the darkness. I tried to explain that I was waiting for my friends, but he just shook his head slowly, his eyes never blinking. "It's dangerous. This place. It's theirs." I asked him what he meant, but he just stood there, staring at me. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he turned and walked back into the darkness. I thought about packing up and leaving, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was a strange, morbid curiosity, but I just sat there staring after him. The night wore on, and I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard things. Rustling leaves, distant whispers, the snap of twigs, and then the growl again, closer this time. I sat up, clutching my flashlight, and pointed it into the trees. That's when I saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of the clearing. It looked like a man, but its limbs were too long, and its movements were jerky, unnatural. I flashed my light on it, and it froze. Its face was human, but twisted, like someone had stretched the skin too tight over its bones. Its eyes gleamed with a cold, hungry light, and I could see something dark and viscous dripping from its mouth. My heart pounded as I scrambled back into my tent, zipping it up as if that thin layer of nylon could protect me. I could hear it moving closer, the crunch of leaves under its feet, the low growl vibrating through the air. I held my breath, praying it would go away, but then I heard a voice, a familiar one. It was the park ranger again. "You can't hide from them," he whispered, his voice coming from all around me. "They know you're here. They always know." I clutched my flashlight like it was a lifeline, willing myself to stay quiet, to stay still. And then, everything went silent. I waited, straining to hear anything, but there was nothing. I thought maybe they'd left, but then I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was my friend's voice, calling my name. "Hey, it's just us, we got lost." It sounded wrong, though, too cheerful, too normal. I knew it wasn't him. My friends wouldn't just show up like that in the middle of the night without a single flashlight. But then I heard them, all their voices calling my name, getting louder and louder until it was a cacophony of familiar sounds, all blending together into one horrible chorus. I unzipped the tent, peeking out just enough to see shadows moving around the campsite. They were shifting, morphing, like they couldn't quite hold their shapes. I watched, horrified, as one of them stretched into the form of the ranger, and then another morphed into something with impossibly long limbs and glowing eyes. It was like they were trying on different skins, different faces. That's when I remembered the legends, skinwalkers, dogmen, creatures that could mimic the voices and faces of humans, drawing them in before they attacked. I'd heard the stories, but I never thought they could be real. Yet here I was, trapped in the woods, surrounded by them. I grabbed my things, barely taking the time to pack, and started running, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from them. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps echoing in the darkness, their voices calling out my name in that same chillingly familiar tone. I ran until I couldn't breathe, until my legs felt like they would give out, and just when I thought I was safe, I saw him again. The park ranger, standing in my path, his eyes glowing in the darkness. "You can't escape," he said, his voice splitting and warping until it sounded like a dozen voices all at once. And then I realized there was no ranger, no cryptid, not in the way I thought. It was them all along, and they weren't just mimicking humans. They were becoming them. They'd found me, and now they had everything they needed. When the search party found my campsite a few days later, they said they saw me, said I looked dazed, like I didn't know where I was. They brought me back to town, but they kept asking me these questions. Strange ones, like where I'd come from and how long I'd been there. I didn't understand at first, but then I saw my reflection, and I knew. I knew why they were asking. I knew why my skin felt tight, why my limbs felt like they didn't belong to me anymore. I knew because I was one of them now, or maybe I always had been. I'd always considered myself a city person, so when my girlfriend Maya convinced me to go camping, I was skeptical. She loved the outdoors and promised that a couple of nights in Wildwood Forest would be just the thing to clear our minds. No work, no distractions, she said, a mischievous sparkle in her eye. I agreed, more for her than for myself, but looking back, I wish I hadn't. We set up our tent in a small clearing, with towering pines casting long shadows over our campsite. The forest was dense, the trees standing so close together they blocked out much of the daylight, giving everything a muted, otherworldly feel. As evening approached, a strange chill settled over the woods, and an uneasy silence fell, broken only by the occasional crack of a branch or a rustle of leaves. Just before sundown, we were startled by a voice behind us. "Hey there, folks." We turned to see a park ranger leaning against a tree, watching us. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face, making it difficult to read his expression. His voice was low and gravelly, and something about the way he stood so still and stiff set my nerves on edge. "Name's Ranger Dean," he introduced himself. "I'd recommend you pack up and head back to the main trail. The forest isn't safe after dark." I forced a smile and nodded, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my gut. "Thanks, but we're fine. We'll be careful." He tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly. "People go missing here," he said, almost a whisper. "Strange things walk these woods, things that don't belong." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as if he'd never been there at all. Maya laughed it off, calling him the creepiest park ranger ever, and soon we were back to roasting marshmallows over the fire. But his words lingered in my mind, a dark undercurrent beneath the crackle of the flames. That night I woke to a strange sound, low, guttural, almost like an animal growling. I sat up, straining to hear, but all I caught was the faint whisper of pine needles brushing against each other in the wind. I was about to lie back down when I heard it again, closer this time. I reached over and shook Maya awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She groggily nodded, eyes wide with fear. We sat there holding our breaths as the growl grew louder, closer, until it seemed to circle our tent. And then there was a scratching noise, like claws raking over the fabric. I grabbed the flashlight, my heart pounding, and slowly unzipped the tent. I shone the beam into the darkness, and that's when I saw it. Just beyond the firelight, half hidden among the trees, stood a creature. It looked like a man, but taller, gaunt, with elongated limbs and glowing yellow eyes that seemed to burn into my soul. It moved unnaturally, limbs jerking and twitching as it took a step toward us. Maya grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "Close the tent," she hissed, and I did, my hands shaking. We huddled together, listening as the creature prowled around our campsite, the sound of its footsteps crunching through the underbrush. At one point, it stopped directly outside the tent, its shadow looming over us. I held my breath, waiting for it to leave, but it lingered like it was savoring our fear. Finally, after what felt like hours, the creature wandered away. We stayed up the rest of the night, too terrified to sleep, jumping at every rustle and creak in the forest. At dawn, we packed up and started down the trail, desperate to put distance between us and whatever had stalked us in the night. But after a few minutes of walking, we heard a familiar voice. "Leaving so soon?" We spun around to see Ranger Dean standing in the middle of the path, a twisted smile on his face. There was something off about him. His features seemed blurred, like they were shifting ever so slightly. And then, in a moment of horror, I realized why. His face wasn't his own. It was flickering, changing, almost like it was trying on different faces, different people. I blinked, and for a brief second, his face looked like mine. "You can't leave," he said, his voice now a chilling mimicry of my own. Without another word, we turned and ran, plunging through the forest, ignoring the paths and trails as we scrambled to escape. Branches whipped at my face and my lungs burned, but I didn't dare stop. Maya was right behind me, but no matter how fast we ran, I could hear the footsteps following us, getting closer and closer. Finally, we burst out of the trees and onto the road where we'd parked. We threw ourselves into the car, peeling out of there without looking back. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him, Ranger Dean, standing at the edge of the woods, his face contorting into that horrible, shifting mask. And then, with a sickening jolt, I realized I'd seen that face before. It wasn't just a park ranger. It was me. It was Maya. It was all the missing people he had ever hunted in these woods. We never spoke about what happened that night, but every time I close my eyes, I see him, feel him lurking in the shadows, waiting. I know now that the forest wasn't just a place. It was a trap, a hunting ground for something that could become anyone, anything, and it wore their faces like masks. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear him calling my name, whispering from just beyond the tree line. I wasn't supposed to be out there alone. The cabin was a rustic one-room structure deep in the heart of Misty Pines Forest, a spot so remote you had to hike 2 miles off the main trail just to reach it. My buddies and I had planned a weekend trip, but at the last minute everyone bailed. I should have left too, but I was stubborn. I'd been looking forward to this weekend of solitude for months. By sunset, the silence had taken on an oppressive weight, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I'd built a small fire and was nursing a beer, the only sound the crackling flames and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful until I heard it, the faintest hint of a whisper carried on the wind. At first I thought it was just the trees creaking as they swayed, but then it happened again, clearer this time. It was a voice, a low murmur, calling my name. Tom. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to brush it off. Probably just the wind, I told myself. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that I was being watched. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the surrounding trees, but all I saw were shadows stretching into the darkness. Then I noticed something odd. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of insects and distant animal calls, had fallen completely silent. I turned off my flashlight, hoping the darkness would calm my nerves. But then I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the firelight. My heart stopped. It was a man, but his posture was unnatural, almost as if he were trying too hard to look human. He was tall and gangly, with limbs that seemed too long and a head that was slightly tilted, as if he were observing me with a kind of morbid curiosity. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a slow, deliberate step forward. I noticed then that his clothes didn't seem quite right. They hung off him like they'd been stolen from someone else. His face was obscured by shadows, but his eyes, those eyes shone with an eerie, unnatural light. It felt as though they were piercing right through me. "Are you lost?" I asked, even as my instincts screamed at me to run. He didn't answer, but I heard something behind me, a rustling noise, and spun around. Nothing. I turned back and he was gone, but in his place there was something else. A faint whisper, the same voice calling my name. "Tom, come here." I backed away, nearly tripping over a log. Panic set in, and I decided to get inside the cabin. I slammed the door and bolted it, my heart hammering in my chest. The silence in the cabin was suffocating, but outside the whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. And then they changed. It was no longer just my name. Now it was Maya's voice, my ex-girlfriend calling me, begging for help. But it couldn't be her. She was back in the city, and yet the voice was unmistakable. "Tom, please, come outside. I need you." I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but the voices multiplied, overlapping, each one a different person from my past, some I hadn't thought about in years. Their calls became a cacophony, a twisting, nauseating blend of familiar voices pleading, accusing, whispering secrets I hadn't told anyone. I staggered to the window and peered out, desperate to see if anyone was actually out there. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to reveal something moving at the edge of the clearing. It was the same figure, but now there were others with him, shadows that shifted and moved in unison, as if they were all connected by invisible strings. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed my bag, threw open the door, and bolted into the night. I ran blindly, my flashlight bouncing wildly, catching glimpses of twisted trees and gnarled roots. But no matter how far I went, the whispers followed, growing louder and more frantic, each step drawing me deeper into the forest. I didn't stop until I burst onto the main trail, gasping for breath, my heart ready to burst from my chest. I paused, hoping the silence meant I'd outrun whatever was following me. But as I turned to look back, I saw them standing there just at the edge of the trees, watching me. The figure from the clearing stood at the front, his head tilted, his eyes glowing in the darkness. And then, to my horror, he spoke. "Tom," he said in my own voice, "you can't leave, not without us." The others stepped forward, and as they moved into the moonlight, I saw their faces. They were all me, twisted reflections, each one with an expression of malice or sorrow, as if they were trapped in some eternal torment, forever bound to the forest. I ran back to my car, desperate to escape, and didn't stop until I was miles away. But even now, back in the safety of my apartment, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, waiting for me. And sometimes in the dead of night I hear the whispers, faint but unmistakable, calling my name from the shadows. Because the forest knows me now, and one day I'll have to go back. It started with a dare. My friends and I were sitting around a campfire, swapping ghost stories, our laughter echoing through the forest. That's when Jason brought it up, the old cabin hidden deep in the woods, rumored to be haunted. They said people who went looking for it never came back the same, or never came back at all. Of course, he dared me to find it. Said I wouldn't have the guts. So I went alone. I left my friends behind, their laughter fading as I pushed further into the forest. The trees grew denser, the underbrush thicker. Soon I was swallowed up by the woods, the sunlight fading to a dim twilight under the thick canopy above. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of wet earth and decay. I could hear the sounds of animals scurrying in the undergrowth, but something felt off. The forest felt too still, too quiet. It was as if the trees themselves were watching me, waiting for me to cross some invisible line. After what felt like hours, I found it, a small, decrepit cabin half hidden behind a thicket of brambles. The wood was gray and rotting, the windows shattered and dark. It looked as if it had been abandoned for decades, maybe longer. But there was something strange about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The air around the cabin was colder, almost unnaturally so, and there was an oppressive silence that seemed to hang over the place like a shroud. "Nang!" I approached the door, which hung crookedly on its hinges, and pushed it open. The wood groaned, a sound that echoed through the empty cabin like a dying breath. I stepped inside, flashlight in hand, and took in my surroundings. The cabin was small, just one room with a dusty table, a broken chair, and what looked like an old rusted wood stove. But the thing that caught my eye was a strange symbol carved into the wall, a crude drawing of something that looked like a human figure, but twisted with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. The moment I saw it, I felt a chill wash over me. I'd seen drawings like this before, in books, on the internet, cryptid folklore. My pulse quickened as I remembered the stories, tales of creatures that lurked in the woods, feeding on the fear of those who dared to enter their territory. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a story, but I couldn't ignore the sense of dread that was building inside me. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard something. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the rustling of leaves, but there were no trees inside the cabin. I swung my flashlight around, illuminating the shadows, but there was nothing, just empty air. I laughed, a nervous, shaky sound, and took a step towards the door. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just outside the cabin, watching me through the broken window. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch and bend in unnatural ways. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were deep black pits that seemed to swallow the light. It had no face, no mouth, yet I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, like a blade slicing through me. I froze, my heart pounding as the creature tilted its head as if curious, its body moving with a fluid, unnatural grace. It raised one long, bony arm and beckoned to me, its fingers curling in a slow, deliberate motion. I felt a pull, a strange, almost magnetic force drawing me towards it, and before I knew it, I was moving, my feet carrying me to the door without my permission. I fought against it, every muscle in my body screaming to stop, but I couldn't. I was powerless, a puppet being drawn towards the thing in the woods. As I stepped out of the cabin, the creature backed away, disappearing into the shadows, and I followed, my mind numb with terror. The forest around me seemed to warp and twist as I walked, the trees bending and stretching as if alive. I could hear whispers, soft and sibilant, filling the air with words I couldn't understand. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to turn back, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was trapped, caught in the creature's web, and there was nothing I could do to escape. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the pull released me. I stumbled, gasping for breath, and looked around. The creature was gone, vanished into the night, but I could still feel its presence, lurking just beyond the edge of the darkness. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, my heart pounding as I fled the cursed cabin and the horrors it contained. When I finally made it back to the campsite, my friends were gone. The fire was cold, the logs charred and blackened, as if it had been out for hours. I called out for them, my voice echoing through the empty woods, but there was no reply. I searched for hours, calling their names, but there was nothing. Just silence, as if the forest had swallowed them whole. I don't know how long I searched, but eventually I stumbled back to my car and drove away, my mind numb with fear. I never found out what happened to my friends. They were just gone, vanished without a trace, as if they had never existed. But I know they were there. I remember their laughter, their faces, the way they dared me to find the cabin. Sometimes late at night I hear them calling my name, their voices faint and distant, like an echo from another world, and I know deep down that they're still out there, lost in the shadows of the forest, forever caught in the creature's web, waiting for the next fool who dares to enter the woods alone. I've been a park ranger for about 10 years now. I took the job because I liked the quiet, the solitude, the escape from the chaos of the outside world. The woods had always been my refuge, a place I thought I understood better than anything else. But there are parts of these woods, dark corners where the sunlight never seems to reach, that don't feel like they belong to the world I know. It started on an unseasonably cold night. My radio crackled with static, and dispatch called in with a report of strange noises near the northern edge of the park. Rumors had been floating around for weeks. Campers claiming they'd seen things lurking in the shadows, heard whispers that echoed through the trees, and strange tracks leading nowhere. I usually chalked it up to overactive imaginations, but tonight, something in the air felt different. It was thick, oppressive, and heavy with a chill that clung to my skin. I set out on foot, following the trailhead that cut through the heart of the forest. The moon was barely a sliver in the sky, and every step felt like it echoed a little too loudly, bouncing back at me from the trees. I walked deeper, letting the canopy swallow me whole. That's when I first heard it. A low, guttural growl, distant but unmistakable. I stood still, straining to hear. The growl came again, this time closer. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever encountered. It sounded wrong, twisted, like a creature trying to mimic a sound it had only heard once. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I forced myself to press on, rationalizing it as a big cat or a bear. The deeper I went, the stranger things became. I noticed carvings on the trees, symbols I didn't recognize, crude shapes that seemed to pulse under my flashlight. They felt ancient, as if they'd been there long before I ever set foot in these woods. And then there were the smells, rotting meat, damp earth, something metallic, like blood left to bake under the sun. As I moved further, I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, shapes shifting in the shadows, following me but never fully revealing themselves. I quickened my pace, but the creatures matched it, staying just out of reach, teasing me. I was no longer alone in the woods. I stumbled upon a clearing and froze. There in the center was a large stone circle, arranged like some kind of ancient altar. At first glance it looked abandoned, but then I saw it. A figure, crouched over, barely visible in the dim light. Its back was to me, covered in matted fur, its limbs unnaturally long and thin, twisted like they'd been stretched. I should have turned and run, but something in the back of my mind held me there, an inexplicable need to understand what I was seeing. As I watched, the creature slowly straightened, revealing a face that was neither animal nor human, its eyes dark voids that seemed to suck the light from the world around them. My breath caught in my throat as it turned fully, tilting its head as though it recognized me. "You came back," it rasped, and the voice was familiar, chillingly so. It was my own voice, mimicked back to me with an unnatural, hollow echo. Suddenly, memories that weren't mine began flooding my mind. Flashes of ancient rituals, blood-soaked ceremonies, and figures in cloaks chanting in a language I didn't understand. But somehow, I did. I felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu, as if I'd been here before centuries ago. I stumbled back, gripping my head as the creature advanced, its gaze locked onto mine with a malevolent intelligence that seemed to reach into the depths of my soul. I broke free from the clearing, sprinting blindly through the trees, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever that thing was. But no matter how far I ran, the whispers followed, threading through the trees, wrapping around me like a noose. I burst out of the woods, breathless and trembling, but something was wrong. The landscape was the same, yet different. The trees seemed older, twisted, and the air felt denser, filled with a metallic taste that clung to my tongue. I glanced back, but the forest had closed in behind me as though swallowing the path I'd taken. I scrambled back to the ranger station, but when I reached the door, my reflection stared back at me through the window, and I barely recognized it. My face was gaunt, my eyes hollow, like I hadn't slept in days, but it was my eyes that terrified me most. They weren't mine at all. They were the creature's eyes, black and bottomless, as if something ancient was looking through them. Realization settled in, cold and unforgiving. The symbols, the memories, the creature. This was my connection to the woods, a dark lineage that had drawn me here long before I was born. I was not merely a visitor. I was a part of it, bound to the forest and the creatures within it. I felt a dark, twisted satisfaction, as if a piece of myself had been restored, even as I stood there, horrified. The whispers returned, stronger now, filling my head with thoughts that weren't mine, a hunger that wasn't mine. The woods had claimed me, and I understood finally that I would never leave. As I write this, the hunger grows, the moon will rise soon, and I can already feel my body beginning to change. There are others out there, waiting for me, calling me home. I thought I was a protector of these woods, but I was wrong. I am their prisoner, their offspring, cursed to roam these trees for as long as they stand, forever part of the whispers in the pines. I'd been planning this trip for weeks, desperate to get away from the noise of the city, the constant barrage of people, and the claustrophobic walls of my apartment. So, when the weekend finally came, I drove out to the forest. I'd chosen a spot well off the beaten path, one that promised solitude and silence, just me and the trees, a perfect escape. I set up camp near an old fire pit, abandoned and overgrown. The forest was dense, with towering pines that seemed to close in around me as the light waned. Shadows stretched long and strange, twisting and reaching toward the clearing like fingers. I tried not to notice, telling myself it was just the typical forest atmosphere. I've camped alone before, but there was a heaviness here that felt different, like I wasn't truly alone. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I got the fire going and settled in with a cup of coffee, letting the warmth calm my nerves. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional rustling in the underbrush. I told myself it was just small animals, rabbits, maybe a raccoon. But each rustle felt calculated, deliberate. I strained to listen, but there was nothing. No birds, no crickets, just an eerie, suffocating quiet. The first real sign that something was wrong came just after midnight. I was dozing by the fire when a snap of a branch jolted me awake. I grabbed my flashlight, scanning the trees. I called out, my voice feeling small and hollow in the vastness of the woods, but there was no reply. Just silence again. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just a deer, maybe an elk. But then I heard it, a whisper. It was faint, barely there but unmistakable. It wasn't my name, at least not exactly. It was like an imitation, a mimicry, as if something had heard my name once but didn't quite understand how to say it. My skin prickled and a chill ran down my spine. I shone the flashlight around, but the beam only reached so far before it was swallowed by the darkness. I tried to calm myself, but my nerves were frayed, every instinct screaming that I was being watched. I thought about packing up, leaving right then and there, but part of me didn't want to admit defeat. I was just being paranoid, I told myself. There was nothing out here but trees and shadows. But then I saw it, a figure at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that were too thin, too long. It stood there watching me, its head tilted like a curious dog, but there was nothing curious about its eyes. They were black pits, empty and hollow, staring at me as if they could see straight into my soul. I froze, flashlight trained on it, but the beam did nothing to reveal its features. It was as if it were made of shadow, a living darkness that drank in the light. And then it smiled. I don't know how else to describe it. A slow, unnatural stretching of what might have been a mouth, revealing rows of teeth that were jagged and sharp, too many teeth to fit in any normal mouth. Panic surged through me, but my legs felt rooted to the ground, locked in place by those eyes, that horrible, predatory smile. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body betrayed me. The creature took a step forward, its long limbs moving with a grotesque fluidity, like it wasn't constrained by bones or flesh. It spoke again, that same broken imitation of my name, the sound scraping across my ears like nails on a chalkboard. I could feel the weight of its gaze pressing down on me, a suffocating presence that seemed to reach into my mind, clawing at my thoughts, pulling them apart. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, as if it had melted into the shadows. I stood there gasping for breath, my heart pounding so loud I thought it would burst. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I grabbed my pack and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that thing. I tripped and stumbled, branches clawing at my arms and face, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Somehow I made it back to my car, adrenaline and terror carrying me through the trees. I didn't even look back as I peeled out, tearing down the dirt road as fast as I could, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever lurked in that forest. When I finally stopped miles away, safe inside a brightly lit gas station, I tried to catch my breath, to calm the wild panic that still gripped me. I glanced at myself in the bathroom mirror and froze. My face was pale, my eyes wide, and there, just behind me in the reflection, I saw it. That same dark figure standing at the edge of the room, watching me, its mouth stretched wide in that awful, jagged smile. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just an empty room. But when I looked back in the mirror, it was still there, smiling, waiting. And that's when I understood it had followed me. It wasn't bound to the forest, it was bound to me. And no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, it would always be there, watching, waiting, with that smile that promised something far worse than death. There's a particular stretch of woods in the mountains near my hometown that everyone avoids. Growing up, we'd hear stories from the older folks about strange lights, sightings of shadowy figures, and something inhuman lurking between the trees. The place was practically a local legend, but no one I knew had ever actually gone there, until one night when I decided to do just that. I'd always prided myself on not scaring easily. Ghost stories and urban legends were just that, stories. But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see this haunted forest for myself. I figured it would be just another quiet night of camping, only this time with an added layer of creepiness to make things interesting. I set off just before sunset, hiking up the narrow, overgrown trail that led to the old campsite. The trees here were massive, ancient things that twisted and turned, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The deeper I went, the thicker the air seemed to get, like I was walking through some invisible fog that clung to my skin and weighed down my steps. I'd heard the birds when I first started the hike, but now, silence. Absolute, unsettling silence. By the time I reached the clearing, dusk had settled in. I pitched my tent near the remains of an old fire pit and got a small fire going. The flames cast long shadows that seemed to dance and sway as if they were alive. I tried to shake the feeling of being watched. I was alone. At least I told myself that. The woods had a way of playing tricks on your mind, especially at night. I settled by the fire, staring into the flames, letting their warmth seep into my bones. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it. A faint sound like someone breathing just beyond the firelight. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. I held my breath, straining to listen. It was subtle, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but there was a rhythm to it. Inhale, exhale, slow and deliberate. I scanned the darkness, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam cut through the trees, but there was nothing. No animal, no person, just empty forest. But the breathing continued, steady and unnatural, surrounding me as if it were coming from all directions at once. I backed up, inching closer to the fire, hoping its light would ward off whatever was lurking in the shadows. And then I saw it, movement, just at the edge of my vision. A dark figure, tall and thin, standing perfectly still between two trees. My pulse quickened as I swung the flashlight towards it, but by the time the beam reached the spot, it was gone. My heart pounded, a cold sweat breaking out as I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe a trick of the light, shadows playing tricks on me. I was grasping at straws, trying to convince myself that I hadn't just seen something that shouldn't exist. But then I heard it again, that breathing, now closer, louder, like someone standing right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. My mind raced, panic creeping in as I realized that whatever this thing was, it wasn't following the rules. It didn't seem bound by the physical world. It moved like a shadow, silent and unseen, slipping in and out of the darkness with ease. I thought about packing up, leaving, but something held me there. Some morbid curiosity maybe, or sheer terror. I wanted to know what I was dealing with. So I stayed. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, waiting, watching the shadows that seemed to close in around me. And that's when I saw it again, standing just beyond the light. This time I could make out its shape. A grotesque, elongated figure, with limbs that were too long and bent at unnatural angles. Its head was twisted, cocked to one side as if it were studying me, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They were yellow, almost like an animal's, but filled with a cold, calculating intelligence that chilled me to the bone. The thing opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth, and let out a low, guttural sound that sent a wave of nausea through me. It took a step forward, and that's when I saw it more clearly. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, almost translucent, like it had been starved for centuries. The creature took another step, and I could see it was covered in patches of dark, matted fur, like some twisted mix of man and beast. I stumbled backward, falling onto the ground as the creature moved closer, its eyes never leaving mine. I was trapped, paralyzed by fear, unable to move, to scream, to do anything but watch as it came closer and closer still. And then, just as it reached the edge of the firelight, it stopped. It tilted its head again, as if contemplating me, and then it did something I will never forget. It smiled. That smile was the worst thing I've ever seen. It stretched impossibly wide, splitting its face almost in two, revealing teeth that seemed to go on forever. The creature let out a hissing laugh, a sound that grated on my ears like nails on a chalkboard, and then it turned and disappeared back into the shadows, melting into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. I don't know how long I sat there shaking, trying to process what I'd just seen. Eventually, I forced myself to my feet, packed up my things, and left. I didn't run, I didn't dare. I walked slowly, deliberately, knowing that if I ran, it would come back. I could feel its eyes on me the entire way, watching from the shadows, following me, but never coming close again. When I finally made it back to the trailhead, I felt a strange sense of relief, but also a nagging dread, as if a part of that forest had clung to me, refusing to let go. I haven't been back since, but sometimes late at night I hear that breathing, that slow, deliberate inhale and exhale, and I know it's out there, waiting, watching, just beyond the edge of the light. I've always felt at home in the woods. There's something about the solitude, the silence that calls to me, so when my friends Mark and Lila invited me on a camping trip, I didn't hesitate. 3 days in the deep forest, away from the noise of the city, it sounded perfect. We hiked for hours, further than we'd ever gone before. The trees here were ancient, towering over us like silent sentinels. The deeper we went, the more the air seemed to change. It was colder, heavier, carrying a faint, metallic scent that made my skin crawl. But we shrugged it off, eager to set up camp before nightfall. The first night was uneventful. We built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and swapped ghost stories. Lila told a particularly creepy tale about dogmen, these hulking, werewolf-like creatures that supposedly stalk the woods at night. She claimed to have heard stories from her grandfather about them, how they were half man, half beast, and how they could smell fear. We laughed it off as we crawled into our tents, the stories lingering in our minds. But that laughter died by the second night. It started with the howling, far off but loud enough to make the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I told myself it was just a coyote or maybe a wolf, but this howl was different, deeper, almost human. We huddled around the fire, peering into the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just shadows stretching and shifting, as if the trees themselves were alive. Mark suggested we go for a short walk to clear our heads. It seemed like a good idea, so we grabbed our flashlights and wandered into the trees, keeping close together. We hadn't gone far when we saw it, a massive figure standing just outside the beam of our flashlights. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with fur that seemed to swallow the light. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its teeth were bared in a snarl. "Run," I whispered, my voice barely a breath. We turned and bolted, tearing through the underbrush, desperate to put as much distance as we could between us and that thing. I could hear its heavy footsteps behind us, growing louder, closer. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. We burst into the clearing where our tents were, gasping for breath. Did you see that?" Lila stammered, her eyes wide with terror. Mark nodded, his face pale. "Dogman," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "It's real. It's hunting us." We spent the rest of the night by the fire, too afraid to sleep, our eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Every now and then we'd hear rustling, branches snapping, or a low growl that sent chills down my spine. I could feel it watching us, waiting, savoring our fear. By the third day we were desperate to leave, but the forest seemed to have other plans. No matter which path we took, we always ended up back at the campsite. It was as if the woods were toying with us, keeping us trapped within its twisted maze. The scent of rot hung heavy in the air, and the shadows seemed to move, closing in around us. That night the dogman returned, but it wasn't alone. There were others, shadows moving through the trees, their eyes glowing in the darkness. They circled our camp, their growls filling the air, each one louder than the last. Mark grabbed a branch from the fire, holding it out like a weapon, but we all knew it was useless. There was no fighting them. We were at their mercy. And then they attacked. I don't remember much after that, just flashes, teeth, claws, the sound of Lila screaming. I ran, my feet carrying me through the trees, driven by pure, unthinking terror. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches snagging at my clothes, roots tripping me up. I could hear them behind me, their heavy breaths, the sound of their claws tearing through the underbrush. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew, I was lying on the forest floor, the morning light filtering through the trees. My clothes were torn, my body covered in cuts and bruises. But I was alive. There was no sign of Mark or Lila, just a quiet that felt more oppressive than any silence I'd ever known. I stumbled back to the trailhead, half mad with fear, my mind replaying those final moments over and over. I still don't know what happened to them, or why the dogmen let me go, but I know this. Those woods aren't empty. They're haunted by something ancient, something malevolent, that thrives on fear. So if you ever find yourself deep in the forest, far from the safety of the world you know, remember this. You are not alone. They're watching, waiting. And if they set their sights on you, there's no escaping. Because once they've chosen you, you're theirs. I still hear them sometimes in my dreams, the growls, the snapping of branches, the feeling of claws digging into my flesh. And every time I wake up, covered in sweat, my heart racing. Because I know that one day they'll come for me, and when they do, there'll be no running. It started like every other camping trip I'd taken, full of excitement, a sense of adventure, and a small nagging feeling that something could go wrong. But that's just part of camping, right? You embrace the wild. You invite the unexpected. I'd hiked out to a secluded part of the forest where the pines grew thick and tall, like ancient guardians standing watch. The underbrush was dense, and the forest floor was so soft with fallen needles that my footsteps barely made a sound. I felt like a ghost as I moved through the woods, silent and unseen. After a few hours of hiking, I found the perfect spot, a small clearing surrounded by towering trees, with just enough space to pitch my tent and make a fire. As I set up camp, the late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long, finger-like shadows that seemed to stretch and grab at the edges of the clearing. I shook off the unease creeping up my spine. I'd been alone in the woods before. This was nothing new. I got a fire going just as dusk fell, watching the flames lick and snap, casting flickering light into the growing darkness around me. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but there was an unnatural stillness in the air, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Even the usual forest sounds, rustling leaves, chirping insects, had faded away, leaving only an oppressive silence that weighed heavy on my chest. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, so deep it vibrated in my bones. My first thought was a bear, but there was something off about the sound. It wasn't just a growl. It was something else, something wrong. It seemed to echo, surrounding me, coming from every direction at once. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the darkness, the beam cutting through the shadows, but revealing nothing. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a coyote or a wolf, but my gut told me otherwise. I sat by the fire, clutching my flashlight and knife, forcing myself to stay calm. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. I lost track of time as fear twisted my sense of reality. I was just about to crawl into my tent when I heard footsteps, soft and slow, pacing around the edge of the clearing. I held my breath, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. I strained my ears, trying to make out more than just the footsteps, but it was like the forest had swallowed all other sounds. And then a voice, a low rasping whisper that barely sounded human. It called my name. My blood turned to ice. There was no way anyone knew I was out here. I hadn't told anyone my exact location. I hadn't seen a single soul since I started hiking. But it called my name again, louder this time, and closer. I backed up against a tree, clutching my knife so tightly my knuckles went white. My flashlight flickered, the beam faltering as if the darkness was trying to consume it. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. I could feel the weight of something watching me, something unseen but undeniably present. I squinted into the shadows, and that's when I saw it, a pair of eyes reflecting the light high up in the trees. They weren't animal eyes, though. They were too large, too bright, and filled with a strange, hungry intelligence. They locked onto me, unblinking. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. I was trapped, paralyzed by those eyes that seemed to bore into my soul, peeling back layers of my sanity. The thing in the trees let out a sound, a chilling mimicry of human laughter, but twisted and distorted like it had learned laughter from the screams of its victims. In a desperate move, I turned and ran. Branches whipped my face and roots seemed to reach out, trying to trip me as I fled through the darkness. I didn't care where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. The laughter followed me, growing louder, echoing through the trees until it was all I could hear. Suddenly, I stumbled into another clearing, a small pond shimmering under the thin moonlight. For a moment I thought I was safe. But then I saw them, more eyes, scattered around the trees watching me. Dozens of them, all glowing in the darkness, unblinking, unfeeling. And there, standing at the edge of the water, was something out of a nightmare. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over bones that jutted out at unnatural angles. And its face, God, its face was a grotesque parody of a human face with hollow black eyes and a mouth that stretched too wide, filled with jagged, animalistic teeth. The creature took a step toward me, its head tilting in curiosity, or maybe hunger. My mind screamed at me to move, but my body wouldn't obey. I was rooted to the spot, a prey animal caught in the gaze of something far beyond comprehension. It opened its mouth, and a strange, garbled sound escaped, halfway between a growl and a scream, like it was trying to speak but didn't know how. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and disappeared into the shadows, melting into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. The other eyes blinked out one by one, leaving me alone in the silent, oppressive night. I stumbled back to my camp, half expecting the creature to appear again, to finish what it had started. But the woods remained still, silent, as if they were hiding a terrible secret. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, jumping at every shadow, every rustle of leaves, waiting for the nightmare to return. When dawn finally broke, I packed up and left, barely daring to look over my shoulder as I fled the forest. But even now, back in the safety of my home, I can't escape those eyes. I see them in the dark corners of my room, in the shadows that stretch across the walls, always watching, waiting. And every now and then, late at night, I hear it, that twisted, garbled laughter echoing from the forest beyond, as if it's calling me back, as if it's just waiting for the next time I decide to brave the woods alone. But I know this now, the forest holds secrets and not all of them let you leave. It was late in the season, just as the leaves were starting to change, when I got the call to patrol Pine Ridge. The park was empty, as it usually was this time of year, and the tourists had long since left. This stretch of the forest was always the quietest. People said it was because of the remoteness, but I'd heard other theories. The locals spoke of Pine Ridge with a kind of reverence, like it held some ancient secret they didn't want to disturb. I didn't pay much attention to their stories. Ghosts, creatures, spirits. Every park had its tales, and I'd yet to encounter anything that wasn't explainable. Still, I felt a strange tension as I hiked up the trail that night, the air unnaturally cold and thick with the smell of damp earth. I kept telling myself it was just the season, but something in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. It wasn't long before I noticed the sounds. At first, it was just the creaking of the trees, which was normal enough, but soon it turned into something more, a distant scraping, like claws raking against wood. I paused, straining my ears, trying to pinpoint the direction. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a low, persistent noise that set my nerves on edge. I'd never felt truly afraid in these woods until that moment. I pulled out my flashlight, casting it in a slow arc around me, illuminating the trunks and twisted branches. That's when I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. Its body was hunched, its limbs too long, fingers ending in sharp points that seemed to scrape the bark of the trees as it moved. I called out, hoping it was just a person, maybe a lost camper or a hunter. But the figure didn't respond. It stood there, frozen, its head tilting slightly as if to listen. I raised my light higher, trying to get a better look, but it backed away, melting into the shadows. I could still hear that scraping noise, though, growing fainter as it retreated. I decided to follow it. I don't know why. Curiosity, maybe, or a sense of duty. After all, this was my territory. As I pressed deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The trail had vanished, replaced by an overgrown path that twisted and turned in unnatural ways. I felt disoriented, but I kept going, driven by some unexplainable compulsion to find the source of the sound. I came to a small clearing, and that's when I saw them, figures, more of them, moving in slow, jerky motions around a large, ancient tree in the center. They looked almost human, but there was something wrong about their proportions, the way their limbs stretched unnaturally and their heads tilted too far to one side. They were scratching at the tree, their fingers digging into the bark, pulling it away in long, thin strips. I took a step back, but one of the figures turned, its hollow eyes fixing on me. They were black, like pits, with no light or reflection. It opened its mouth, and I expected a scream, a howl, something. But instead I heard my own voice. It was repeating something I'd said earlier, words I'd spoken into the empty forest, now coming back to me in a hollow, mocking echo. I belong here. I belong here. I felt a wave of nausea as the realization hit me. These things were mimics, creatures that could take on voices, repeat them, distort them. I tried to move, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the sight of them. And then, as if noticing me for the first time, they all stopped, turning in unison to face me, their mouths moving in eerie synchronization, repeating my words in a haunting chorus. Suddenly the ground beneath me gave way and I was falling. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I realized I'd tumbled into a pit, a hollow in the earth that had been hidden by leaves and branches. As I struggled to my feet, I saw what lay around me, bones, countless bones, scattered across the dirt floor. Human bones, animal bones, all jumbled together, some so old they crumbled to dust at my touch. I tried to climb out, but the sides of the pit were too steep, too slick with moss and dirt. I could hear the creatures above me, whispering, scraping, moving closer to the edge. One of them peered down at me, its face stretching into a grotesque grin as it reached down, extending one of its unnaturally long fingers toward me. I scrambled back, pressing myself against the side of the pit, my heart hammering in my chest. And then I saw something even worse. Among the bones there were pieces of fabric, scraps of park ranger uniforms, and a name tag, tarnished and barely readable. I picked it up, my hands trembling. It was my name. That's when I understood. This wasn't just some pit, it was a grave, one I had been to before. I looked down at my hands, and for the first time I noticed how thin they were, how pale, almost skeletal. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, and I remembered things I shouldn't have been able to remember. The feeling of being trapped, the sound of my own voice echoing back at me, distorted, twisted. I had been here before. I had died here before. The creatures above me began to move, their whispers filling the air as they crawled down into the pit, surrounding me, merging with me, pulling me back into the shadows. I felt myself fading, becoming part of the forest, part of the endless repeating cycle of horror that kept these woods alive. And as the darkness closed in, I realized the truth. I was not the ranger. I was the creature, the mimic, the echo that haunted these woods. And now, I was just waiting for the next ranger to come along, to fall into my trap, to join me in the endless nightmare of Pine Ridge. The forest was alive, feeding on fear, on memories, on those who dared to venture too deep. And now, I was part of it, a whisper in the woods, forever calling, forever waiting for the next soul to take my place. I'd always loved camping. There was something about the stillness of the woods, the whisper of the trees, the gentle crackle of a fire. It was peaceful. Or at least, that's what I used to believe. Now, I know better. It started on a cool October weekend with me and my friends, Matt, Sarah, and Jake, hiking deep into the forest, miles away from any semblance of civilization. We were looking for a thrill, something off the beaten path. No cell service, no people, just the four of us and nature. That was the plan. But the deeper we went, the more it felt like we were being watched. The first night, everything seemed normal. We set up camp in a clearing by a small stream, ate dinner, and shared stories around the fire. The sounds of the forest were comforting, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, and the occasional hoot of an owl. But around midnight, I heard something else. A faint, almost imperceptible whispering, carried by the wind. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the breeze playing tricks on me. The next day, things got stranger. We were on a hike, exploring a part of the woods that seemed untouched by human hands. The trees grew denser, their branches twisted like gnarled fingers reaching for us. As we moved further in, we noticed the silence. No birds, no insects, just an eerie, oppressive quiet. It was like the forest was holding its breath. Matt was the first to say something. "Do you feel that?" he asked, looking around, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. "Feel what?" Sarah replied, her voice shaky. "Like, we're not alone," he whispered, barely loud enough for us to hear. I glanced around, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. But the silence was suffocating, and I could feel the weight of unseen eyes on us. We continued hiking, but we were jumpy, flinching at every snapped twig and rustling leaf, and then we saw it, a shadowy figure just beyond the tree line. It was tall, hunched over, with limbs too long to be human. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, piercing through the gloom. For a moment, it was as if time stood still. We all stared, frozen, as the creature seemed to melt back into the shadows. What the hell was that?" Jake stammered, his face pale. None of us had an answer. We tried to convince ourselves it was just a trick of the light, a figment of our overactive imaginations. But deep down we knew better. That night we barely slept. The fire was our only solace, casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance and twist into grotesque shapes. The whispering returned, louder this time, almost like voices, speaking a language none of us could understand. And then the howling started. It was low, guttural, echoing through the trees, sending shivers down my spine. We huddled together, our backs to the fire, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Suddenly, Sarah gasped, pointing into the trees. There, illuminated by the firelight, was a figure. It looked like a man. Except its face was all wrong. It was distorted, stretched, with skin that didn't seem to fit right. Its eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to suck in all the light around them. "Skinwalker," Matt whispered, his voice trembling. He had told us stories about them before, creatures that could mimic humans, taking on their appearance to lure in unsuspecting prey. I had laughed it off at the time, thinking it was just a campfire tale. But now, staring into those empty eyes, I felt the icy grip of fear clawing at my heart. The creature let out a sound, something between a growl and a laugh, and took a step toward us. We didn't wait to see what it would do next. We bolted, running blindly through the trees, branches tearing at our clothes and skin. I could hear footsteps behind us, heavy and relentless like a predator closing in on its prey. Somehow we made it back to the campsite, but the relief was short-lived. Our tents had been shredded, our belongings scattered and torn. The forest had turned on us, and there was no escaping it. We tried to leave, but the path we had taken was gone, swallowed up by the forest. It was as if the woods had rearranged themselves, trapping us within their twisted maze. Hours passed, maybe days. I lost track of time. We were exhausted, our nerves frayed, our minds teetering on the edge of madness. The creatures came for us at night, their eyes glowing in the darkness, their twisted forms lurking just beyond the firelight. We could hear them whispering, calling our names in voices that weren't quite human. And then, one by one, they started to disappear. First Sarah, then Jake. Each time I woke to find their empty sleeping bags and the unmistakable feeling that I was next. I was alone now, surrounded by the shadows, my mind racing with thoughts of what had happened to them. Were they taken? Were they transformed? I shuddered at the thought. I don't know how long I've been here. The days blur together and the darkness never seems to end. I can feel them watching me, their eyes burning into my skin. I know they're waiting, biding their time, and I know that when they come for me, there will be no escape. As I sit here writing this, I realize something terrifying. I can hear footsteps, soft and deliberate, approaching from behind. I don't dare turn around. I know what I'll see. I can already feel the cold, skeletal fingers reaching for me, the whispering growing louder, drowning out my thoughts. If you're hearing this, remember the woods are not empty, they never were, and if you venture too deep, they'll take you too. Because once you've seen them, once you've felt their gaze, they never let you go. I look around hoping for a miracle, but there's nothing, just darkness stretching endlessly, and I know that soon I'll be part of it, another shadow lost in the heart of the forest. I've been a park ranger for nearly 20 years, but I've never seen anything like what happened that night. It started as a routine shift, just me out in the Shady Pines Preserve, a stretch of untouched forest that ran as far as the eye could see. As soon as I set foot into the woods, though, I felt it, that creeping sensation of being watched. I'd walked these paths 1,000 times, but that night they felt foreign, like I was trespassing somewhere I didn't belong. The trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. A dense fog rolled in, curling around the trunks and weaving between the underbrush, muffling sound and warping the familiar landscape into a surreal nightmare. My radio crackled, but all I heard was static. Figures, I thought. Reception had always been spotty out here, but tonight it felt intentional. The first sound that truly unsettled me was a high-pitched whistle. It cut through the silence, piercing and unnatural, like someone imitating a bird but failing miserably. I called out, half hoping someone would answer, half dreading that they would. "Hello? Anyone out there?" Nothing. Just that horrible mocking whistle again, this time closer. I kept walking, gripping my flashlight tighter, the beam barely penetrating the thick fog. Shadows danced at the edges of the light, shifting and twisting as if they had lives of their own. I caught a glimpse of something moving, a flash of gray fur darting between the trees. Dog, I thought at first, but this was no ordinary animal. Its form was all wrong, hunched and massive, like a wolf trying to walk upright. I stumbled back, my heart hammering as I aimed my flashlight where the creature had disappeared. The silence returned, heavy and oppressive. I wanted to call for backup, but I knew no one would reach me in time. The whistle came again, echoing through the trees, and then I heard something worse. A low growl, guttural and deep, vibrating in my chest. A figure stepped into the beam of my flashlight. It was like a man, but horribly wrong, its limbs elongated and twisted, covered in matted fur. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its mouth hung open, filled with jagged teeth. A skinwalker? I'd heard stories, of course, passed around in half-joking conversations around campfires. But seeing one, my blood turned to ice. I turned and ran, branches clawing at my face and arms, tearing my jacket as I crashed through the underbrush. The forest seemed alive, its roots and branches conspiring to trip me up, to slow me down. The growls followed me, sometimes so close I could feel hot breath on the back of my neck. I burst into a small clearing, gasping for air, my flashlight swinging wildly. That's when I saw them, more figures, emerging from the trees, surrounding me. Each one was different, but all shared that same twisted animalistic form. Dogmen, skinwalkers. Creatures I didn't have names for. They moved with a sinister intelligence, watching me with eyes that glowed in the dark. But then, as they closed in, I noticed something strange. They weren't looking at me with hunger or anger. They seemed almost wary. I followed their gaze and turned around. There, standing just a few feet away, was a figure that made my blood run cold. It looked like me. Every detail was perfect. The uniform, the flashlight, even the scratch on my cheek from the branches. But its eyes were empty, dark, and soulless. It smiled, a twisted imitation of a human expression, and spoke in a voice that was mine but wrong. You were never supposed to be here. As it spoke, I felt a sharp, searing pain in my chest, as if something was tearing its way out. I looked down and saw my hands transforming, stretching, sprouting fur. I tried to scream, but the sound came out as a distorted howl. My vision blurred, and I fell to my knees, watching in horror as my reflection morphed into something monstrous. I understood then. I wasn't just a ranger wandering into a forbidden part of the woods. I was one of them, a creature that had once been human, cursed to stalk these woods and lure others to their doom. The memories flooded back, the nights spent hunting, the twisted rituals, the blood. I looked back up at the creatures around me, now familiar kin. They were waiting, watching with dark eyes filled with a terrible understanding. The last of my human thoughts slipped away as I joined them, my new brothers and sisters, and together we melted back into the forest, leaving behind only the whisper of the wind and the faint, mocking whistle that would haunt any who dared to enter our domain. I never used to believe the stories. Growing up near Lonesome Pine National Forest, you hear all sorts of strange tales. But as a park ranger, you learn to laugh them off. Tall tales, urban legends, things that go bump in the night, until you see something you can't explain. It was the middle of October during one of our first real cold snaps of the season. I'd been assigned the graveyard shift to patrol the far end of the park. That area is the least trafficked, a place where most visitors don't venture, and it has a reputation for being strange. People say that the forest feels different there, older somehow, like it's hiding something. My co-workers joked about it, but I'd been there before. It was quiet, sure, but eerie, not really. That night was different, though. The minute I stepped out of the ranger station, I felt it, a sort of tension in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my boots and the faint rustling of the wind through the branches. I kept my flashlight low, moving quietly as I made my way down the narrow, winding trail. I figured I'd just do my rounds, check for any signs of trespassers or poachers, and head back. Routine stuff. I'd been walking for about half an hour when I noticed something strange, a flickering light up ahead. I figured it was campers, maybe some kids who'd snuck in to party. I was just about to radio it in when I heard the singing. It was low and soft, carried on the wind, and it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The voice was female, and the melody was hauntingly familiar, though I couldn't place it. I stepped off the trail, moving toward the light and the voice, curious but cautious. As I got closer, the singing stopped abruptly and the light winked out. I was plunged into darkness, the only light now coming from my own flashlight. I shone it around, looking for any sign of the campers, but there was nothing. Just trees and shadows stretching endlessly in every direction. And that's when I heard the footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. I turned, shining my flashlight back the way I'd come, but there was nothing there. The footsteps stopped, and an uneasy silence settled over the woods. I took a step forward, and that's when I saw it, movement just on the edge of my flashlight beam. A figure stood there half hidden behind a tree. It was a woman, or at least she looked like one. Her clothes were old-fashioned, a long dress that seemed to shimmer in the faint light. She had her back to me, her long tangled hair hanging down her shoulders. I called out to her, asking if she was lost, but she didn't respond. She just stood there, perfectly still. I took a step closer, and as I did, she turned to face me. Her eyes were black, completely black, with no whites at all. Her mouth opened as if she were going to scream, but no sound came out. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I tried to process what I was seeing. That's when she began to move toward me, gliding over the ground like she wasn't even touching it. I turned and ran, sprinting back toward the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. But no matter how fast I ran, I could still hear her footsteps behind me, gaining on me. I burst onto the trail, barely stopping to catch my breath before I took off again, heading back to the station. But as I rounded a bend, I saw something that stopped me cold. It was me. Standing there in the middle of the trail was someone who looked exactly like me. Same uniform, same flashlight, even the same horrified expression. I watched in disbelief as the figure raised its hand, mirroring my movements exactly. It was like looking into a mirror, only this mirror had a mind of its own. Then, without warning, the figure's face twisted into a grin, an impossibly wide smile that stretched far beyond the limits of a human face. Its skin began to ripple, almost like it was made of liquid, and before my eyes it started to change. The skin darkened, the eyes hollowed, and the features morphed into something grotesque, something inhuman. I took a step back, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. This thing, whatever it was, had taken on my appearance, but now it was showing me its true form. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot as the creature advanced. Then I heard a voice, not a whisper, not a growl, but a perfect echo of my own voice. "You don't belong here," it said in a tone that was almost mocking. "This place isn't meant for you." I broke free from my paralysis, my instincts taking over as I turned and ran back the way I'd come. I didn't stop, not even when I heard the creature laughing, its voice blending with the wind in a chilling, unnatural chorus. When I finally reached the ranger station, I slammed the door behind me, locking it tight. The next day I reported what I'd seen, but no one believed me. They chalked it up to exhaustion, a trick of the light, an overactive imagination. But I know what I saw. Since that night, I've refused to go back to that part of the forest. I've heard rumors, whispers of other rangers seeing strange things, but they're always dismissed. They don't want to believe it, don't want to face the truth that there's something out there, something that watches, something that mimics, something that doesn't want us there. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear singing outside my window, soft and familiar, like an old lullaby. And in those moments, I wonder if I ever really left the forest at all. It was just past dusk when I made my way down the old trail, the familiar crunch of pine needles underfoot, blending with the distant call of a whippoorwill. I'd worked at Blackwood National Park for nearly 5 years, guiding tourists, keeping the trails clear, and occasionally dealing with campers who didn't know a bear-proof canister from a garbage bag. But that evening I was alone, performing my final sweep before heading back to the station. Or at least, I thought I was alone. It was early autumn and the air had that crisp bite, smelling faintly of decaying leaves and damp earth. The woods were thick with shadows, darker than usual, and even with my flashlight, visibility was low. But I knew these trails like the back of my hand, or so I thought. I was nearly to the clearing where I'd checked the last campsite when I saw it. Movement out of the corner of my eye. I whipped my flashlight around, catching only a fleeting glimpse of something darting between the trees. Too big to be a deer, too fast to be a bear. It was low to the ground with a hunched, loping gait, almost like it was crawling. I shook it off as a trick of the light, my mind conjuring up shapes from shadows. That's when I heard the laughter. At first I thought it was a coyote or maybe a pair of raccoons, but as I stood there straining to listen, it sounded too human, too deliberate. The laughter was hollow, almost mocking, and it seemed to echo from all around me. I raised my flashlight again, sweeping it across the trees, but there was nothing, just the eerie quiet of the woods. My radio crackled at my hip, startling me out of my thoughts. "Ranger Stevens, do you copy?" It was Dan, the other ranger on duty that night. I lifted the radio to my mouth. "I copy. I'm just doing the last sweep." "Good," he replied, a hint of worry in his voice. "Had a couple of reports from campers saying they heard weird noises out there. You sure everything's okay?" "Yeah," I lied, though I wasn't so sure anymore. "Probably just some kids playing a prank." Dan paused. "Just be careful, all right? There's been some strange things reported in that area lately. I'll catch you back at the station." I clipped the radio back to my belt, trying to shake the creeping unease that was settling into my bones. I forced myself to move forward, rationalizing that the laughter could have been anything. An echo, an animal, my own nerves playing tricks on me. But the further I walked, the thicker the air felt, like I was wading through molasses. And then I found it, the campsite, or rather what was left of it. The tent was shredded, the sleeping bags torn open as if by some massive, clawed creature. I knelt to examine the damage, and that's when I noticed the tracks. They were deep, canine, but far too large, with elongated claw marks. My heart hammered in my chest, and I stood, scanning the area, straining my ears for any sound. That's when I heard it again, the laughter, but this time it was closer, and with it came a voice. "Ranger." It was a whisper, a low, guttural growl that seemed to crawl out from the shadows themselves. I spun around, flashlight casting frantic beams into the darkness, trying to find the source. My hand drifted to the knife at my belt, though I doubted it'd do me any good. Then I saw it, a figure lurking just beyond the reach of my light. At first it looked like a man, tall, lanky, with glowing eyes reflecting back at me. But as I watched, its limbs began to distort, shifting into unnatural angles, its jaw elongating into something that wasn't human. I took a step back, my breath hitching, but my legs felt like they were locked in place. It stepped forward, its form flickering, like a static image trying to break free. I knew enough about the local legends to understand what I was seeing. A skinwalker, a creature of the woods, something ancient and unspeakable. But there was something else too, something deeper in those eyes. Recognition. "Ranger," it repeated, stretching its mouth into a grotesque smile. And then it started to change. Right before my eyes, the creature's form began to shift again, but this time it morphed into something disturbingly familiar. It took on my own face, my uniform, my flashlight. It mimicked my posture perfectly, tilting its head just like I did, even reaching down to where my knife was. It was me. In that moment I realized the truth. This wasn't just a random encounter. This thing had been following me, watching me, learning from me. It wasn't just any skinwalker. It was here for me. A sense of dread washed over me as I realized that if this thing could become me, it could take my place. Nobody would ever know the difference. I stumbled back, the weight of the realization nearly knocking me off my feet. I turned to run, knowing that if I stayed, it would take me, replace me, and no one would ever be the wiser. As I broke through the tree line and ran back to the station, I could still hear that mocking laughter following me, echoing through the woods. When I finally made it back, Dan looked at me, his eyes widening with concern. "You okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." But as I looked into his eyes, I saw a flicker of something familiar. A glint. A reflection that shouldn't have been there. My blood ran cold as the horrifying realization dawned on me. Dan's smile stretched a little too wide, and in that moment I knew that I hadn't escaped at all. I'd brought it back with me. I had been stationed at Black Hollow Woods for about 6 months. I thought I'd seen everything, bear tracks, wolf packs, even a few mountain lions lurking at the edge of the forest. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. I was on the graveyard shift, doing my usual rounds. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The kind of silence that prickles at the back of your neck and makes you feel like something is wrong. I tried to brush it off, but it was hard to ignore the heavy, oppressive feeling that hung in the air, thicker than the mist rolling through the trees. I followed a narrow trail that wound deeper into the woods, one that only a few of us knew about. The light from my flashlight barely pierced the darkness, and the shadows seemed to twist and move as if alive. Every so often I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but every time I turned, there was nothing, just empty, dark woods. After an hour or so, I started hearing strange noises, the kind that don't belong in a forest. There was a faint whispering, like voices just out of earshot. It was unsettling, but what really got under my skin was the laughter. Low and guttural, it sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once, echoing off the trees. I was about to head back when I saw it, a figure standing just off the trail. It looked like a man, but something was off. He was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long, like they'd been stretched. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were glowing a sickly green. I called out, "Hey, are you lost? Do you need help?" The figure just stared at me, tilting its head in a way that made my stomach turn. Then slowly it raised an arm and pointed deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I followed. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the air grew colder with every step. I soon lost track of the trail entirely, but I kept walking as if in a trance, compelled to follow this strange figure. I couldn't explain it, but something inside me needed to know where he was leading me. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a clearing. In the center stood an old, crumbling cabin that looked like it hadn't seen human presence in decades. The door hung off its hinges, and the windows were broken, gaping like empty eye sockets. The figure stepped inside, disappearing into the darkness. I hesitated, but the silence was suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight. I took a deep breath and followed him inside. The cabin reeked of damp earth and decay, and the walls were covered in strange symbols carved into the wood, symbols I didn't recognize. As I moved deeper into the cabin, I realized I was not alone. Shadows shifted in the corners, revealing figures crouched in the darkness. They looked like people, but they weren't. Their skin was gray and mottled, and their eyes glowed with that same sickly green light. They stared at me, unblinking, and began to chant in low, raspy voices. I tried to turn back, but the door was gone. The cabin seemed to close in around me, walls stretching and twisting until I was trapped in a narrow hallway that hadn't been there moments before. The chanting grew louder, filling my head, drowning out my thoughts until all I could hear was their voices. Suddenly, the floorboards beneath me gave way and I fell into darkness. I landed in what felt like a pit, cold and damp, the smell of rot filling my nostrils. My flashlight had gone out, leaving me in complete darkness. I scrambled to my feet, feeling around for a way out, but all I found were more walls, covered in the same strange symbols. Then I heard it, a scraping sound like claws on wood. It was close, too close. I turned, and there in the darkness I saw them, creatures that looked like men but with faces twisted into something monstrous. Their skin was stretched tight over their bones, and their mouths were filled with rows of jagged teeth. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. They closed in, their movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the hunt. I braced myself, knowing there was no escape. But then something strange happened. One of the creatures stopped, sniffing the air. It turned to the others and in a voice that sounded almost human said, "He's one of us." I didn't understand what it meant, but in that moment they hesitated, as if they were unsure. I took the chance and bolted, crashing through the walls that seemed to crumble around me, running until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. When I finally burst out of the cabin, the sun was rising, casting the woods in an eerie, unnatural light. I looked back, but the cabin was gone. Just empty forest, as if it had never been there. I made it back to the station, but things were never the same. Every so often I catch a glimpse of something moving in the woods, a figure that looks a little too much like me, watching with glowing green eyes. I don't know what I saw that night or what it meant, but sometimes I wonder if I ever really left that cabin, or if I'm just another shadow in these woods, waiting for someone else to wander too far and join me. They told me the woods were haunted, but I didn't believe it. I'd been a ranger for over a decade, and I'd heard all the tales. Every park has its own myths, stories spun by locals to spook tourists, keep kids from wandering off. But Dead Hollow, it had more stories than most. It was a thick patch of forest far from any real civilization, full of ancient trees and dense shadows. I'd been assigned to patrol the area for the summer, and I felt more excited than scared. On my second night out there, I noticed something strange. The animals were silent. Normally, there'd be the sound of crickets, owls, maybe the rustle of a deer moving through the underbrush. But that night, the forest was completely still, like a predator was nearby, one that even the trees seemed to fear. I shook it off and went about my rounds. Around midnight, I came across a campsite, one that wasn't supposed to be there. No permit had been issued for this area, and it was miles from any designated spot. The campfire was still smoldering, but there was no sign of people. Tents were there, zipped up tight, but no voices, no movement. I called out, announcing myself as a ranger. Nothing. Only silence. Curious, I approached one of the tents and unzipped it. Inside, there were blankets, a couple of backpacks, but no personal belongings, no clothes, no food, nothing to indicate someone had actually been there. A chill ran through me as I moved to the next tent, repeating the process. Empty. Every single one of them. It was as if whoever had camped here had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the faintest trace of their presence. As I stood there, trying to make sense of it, I heard a sound that nearly stopped my heart, a soft whispering coming from the trees. It wasn't the wind. It had a rhythm, a cadence, like a chant. I couldn't make out the words, but it felt old, ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. I backed away from the campsite, my flashlight flickering as if in warning. I was only a few paces down the trail when I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. There in the shadows stood a figure. It was tall, its limbs too long, its face obscured by darkness. But its eyes glowed like embers, locking onto mine with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I took a step back, and it took a step forward, matching me, mirroring me. It moved with a strange, jerky motion, like it wasn't used to its own body, like it was trying to remember how to be human. I felt rooted to the spot, the hair on my neck standing up as it began to speak. But the voice that came out of it wasn't a single voice. It was many, layered and intertwined, echoing through the trees. "Stay," it said. "Stay with us." I stumbled backward, breaking the trance, and sprinted down the trail. I didn't stop until I reached the old ranger's cabin, my heart hammering in my chest. I slammed the door shut, leaning against it, trying to catch my breath. I knew I couldn't stay there forever, but I needed a moment to think, to make sense of what I'd just seen. That's when I noticed something strange. The room felt colder, darker, like the shadows were pressing in. I flicked on the lights, but they barely cut through the gloom. I grabbed my radio, but all I got was static, a low, grating hiss that seemed to fill the room. And then the whispering started again, this time inside the cabin. I spun around, flashlight raised, and saw them. Figures standing just beyond the reach of the light, their eyes glowing, their mouths moving in silent chants. They were all around me, closing in, their forms flickering like they were barely holding together. I felt the walls of the cabin closing in, and then I realized it wasn't a cabin at all. The walls were trees, the ceiling a canopy of branches. I'd been in the forest all along. Panic surged through me as I staggered backward, tripping over roots and fallen branches. I was back in the woods, but something was wrong. The trees had shifted, twisted into unfamiliar shapes. The path I'd taken was gone, replaced by a dense wall of shadows. I was trapped. And then I saw them clearly, those figures, each one with a familiar face, faces I'd seen before. Old photos of rangers who had disappeared over the years, their portraits hanging in the park's office, memorials to those who'd been lost. They were all here, their eyes glowing with the same otherworldly fire, their voices calling to me, beckoning me to join them. I realized then that I was not the first to wander too deep into Dead Hollow, to hear the whispers, to see the figures. I was just the latest, another ranger who thought he could tame these woods. But these creatures, whatever they were, weren't just spirits or monsters. They were the ones who'd come before me, caught in a cycle, trapped, forgotten. And now, they wanted me to join them. I turned to run, but the figures closed in, their faces twisted into smiles that held no warmth. And as they reached for me, I understood their chant, finally hearing the words clearly. You belong to the forest now. I knew I wouldn't make it out. I would become one of them, another face, another story, another part of the forest's legend. And someday, some new ranger would come, and I would be there, waiting, whispering and calling them to stay. And as I felt myself fading, merging with the shadows, I realized the truth. Dead Hollow didn't just take you. It remade you, forever binding you to its darkness, a part of its unending story. I was the only ranger assigned to the park that summer, a massive expanse of dense woods where the trees grew close together, creating a natural labyrinth that only those truly familiar could navigate without getting lost. The old-timers called it Dead Man's Forest, though I'd never understood why. I'd spent a few summers up here, heard the whispers about people who'd vanished, tales about the beasts that supposedly prowled these woods, but I chalked it up to folklore. Just local color, you know? The first sign that something wasn't right appeared one night just past midnight. I was patrolling the trails, the air thick and unnervingly silent. Even the cicadas, which usually created a constant hum, were quiet. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I was scanning the area with my flashlight when I caught a glimpse of something that made my skin crawl. A pair of eyes reflecting back at me from the darkness, high off the ground like they belonged to something towering. I shone my light toward them, but they disappeared, leaving only the void. A normal person would have felt fear right then, maybe even turned back, but I thought it was just an owl. I'd seen plenty of nocturnal creatures out here that could give you a start if you weren't prepared. I convinced myself it was nothing and moved on. After all, I was the ranger here. If I started jumping at shadows, I'd never make it through the season. But it wasn't long before I heard the footsteps, heavy, deliberate. They crunched through the underbrush somewhere to my left. I stopped in my tracks, my flashlight shaking as I aimed it in the direction of the sound. There was nothing there. Just trees, an endless stretch of trees, but somehow I could feel eyes on me. A primal instinct surged through me, warning me that I was not alone. Something was watching. I turned back toward the cabin, quickening my pace, and that's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl that resonated through the forest, chilling me to the bone. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. There was something wrong about it, almost human, like a twisted echo of someone trying to mimic a wolf. I broke into a run, but the growl followed, now accompanied by rustling that seemed to come from all directions. I felt surrounded. When I made it back to the cabin, I locked the door behind me, breathless and drenched in sweat. I grabbed my shotgun from its place by the door, loading it with shaking hands. The night outside the window was impenetrably dark. There was no moon, no stars, just blackness stretching out over the woods, thick and suffocating. Then came the tapping, a gentle but persistent knock on the window, as if something was toying with me. I aimed my flashlight at the glass, and that's when I saw it. A face stared back at me, not quite human. Its skin was stretched thin over sharp bones, hollow eyes glistening with a predatory gleam. The thing cocked its head to the side, studying me, its lips curling back to reveal a row of jagged teeth. I felt paralyzed, unable to look away. It looked like a man, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its face too gaunt, its eyes too empty. And as I stared, it mouthed something, words that I couldn't hear but could somehow feel in the pit of my stomach. You belong to us. I fired the shotgun. The glass shattered and the creature disappeared. But I wasn't fooled. I could feel its presence outside, lurking in the darkness. I stayed awake all night, clutching the shotgun and jumping at every creak and groan the cabin made. The forest felt alive, like it was watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. The next morning I ventured out, hoping that daylight would chase away whatever horrors I'd encountered. I found tracks in the mud outside the cabin, large clawed prints that I couldn't identify. They were like wolf tracks but larger, and they didn't follow any natural gait. They twisted and turned, sometimes disappearing and reappearing yards away as if the thing that left them could teleport. I spent the rest of the day in a state of high alert, barely eating, barely breathing, constantly looking over my shoulder. And that's when I met them. The campers. I didn't expect to see anyone out here, but there they were, a group of 4 wandering the trail. They looked lost, their faces pale and drawn as they approached me. They told me they'd been hearing strange noises all night, that something had followed them, though they never saw it. I offered to escort them back to their car, figuring that if I was with them, at least I wouldn't be alone. As we walked, they asked me if I'd seen the shapeshifter. I told them it was just an old legend, but they insisted they'd seen it, a creature that could take on the appearance of a man, a wolf, or even blend into the shadows. They said it mimicked voices calling out to them in familiar tones, and that's when I realized the truth. I remembered those footsteps in the woods, the growl that sounded almost human, and the creature's words echoing in my mind. You belong to us. The forest was no longer just a place. It was a trap, a living entity that wanted to claim anyone who wandered too far. We reached their car as dusk began to settle, and I watched them drive away, feeling a pang of envy. They'd escaped. But as I turned back toward the cabin, I saw something that stopped me cold. In the dirt beside the trail was another set of tracks, human footprints, unmistakably mine, leading off deeper into the woods, toward a place I'd never been. With growing horror, I realized those were the steps I had taken the night before, the ones that led me back to the cabin. But there was another set, following close behind, almost overlapping with mine, as if something had been walking in my shadow. I felt a chill run down my spine as I remembered what the campers had said. The creature wasn't just a predator, it was a hunter, tracking its prey by blending into their lives, mirroring them. And then, like a twisted revelation, it hit me. I had never been alone out here. When I stepped back into the cabin, I heard my own voice call out from the darkness behind me, "You belong to us." And in that moment I knew I wasn't the only ranger assigned to this forest. I was merely the latest one who thought he was. I never believed the legends, not really. Stories about creatures lurking in the woods seemed like they were meant to scare kids away from wandering too far. I thought that, as a park ranger, I had seen it all. But that was before last winter, when I encountered something that still haunts me. It was the dead of winter, and the park was nearly empty. A heavy snowstorm was rolling in, so I was closing off the last of the hiking trails and checking that the campsites were all vacant. It was already getting dark, and the snow fell thick and fast, blanketing everything in silence. As I made my way down the last path, my radio crackled to life. It was my supervisor, Jim. "Hey, Mason, you got a report about a missing camper? Some guy named Dan McClure? His car is still in the lot, but nobody's seen him since yesterday." I cursed under my breath. I'd seen the car, but I figured it was just another overnighter who'd head back when the storm hit. "I'll take a quick look around, but he's probably headed back. Storm's getting bad." "Roger that," Jim replied. "Just be careful. These woods have a way of keeping things." The way he said it made me pause. I brushed it off, chalking it up to his usual weird sense of humor, and continued down the trail. Snow crunched under my boots, and the cold was biting, clawing its way through my coat. But something else started to gnaw at me, a feeling I couldn't quite shake, like I wasn't alone. As I walked further, I noticed footprints in the snow, leading off the trail and deeper into the woods. I knew better than to follow, but I couldn't just leave it. Not with someone missing. So I stepped off the path, moving cautiously, and followed the tracks. They were strange, uneven, like someone was stumbling or dragging something. The further I went, the quieter the forest became, until even the sound of my own breathing seemed too loud. The footprints led to a small clearing, and at the center I saw a tent, half buried under the snow. It looked old, as if it had been there for weeks, not days. I called out, "Dan, you there?" My voice felt small, swallowed by the trees around me. There was no answer, just the silence pressing in. I moved closer, my flashlight illuminating the inside of the tent through the thin fabric. I could see scattered belongings, a torn sleeping bag, some canned food, and a backpack. But there was something else too. A deep, jagged claw mark slashed across the side of the tent, and dark stains in the snow around it. They were red, almost black, and they led away from the tent, deeper into the woods. I heard a snap behind me. I turned, flashlight cutting through the trees, but there was nothing there, just shadows and snow. But I knew better. I could feel it. Something was watching me. I took a step back, and then I heard it. A low guttural growl, deep and resonant, echoing through the trees. It was followed by a voice, but it wasn't human. It was as if someone was trying to speak through layers of ice and snow, choked and broken. "Mason." The voice rasped, distorted and hollow. "Help. Me." I felt my blood turn to ice. I had never told Jim where I was heading, and no one else knew my name. I scanned the trees, and that's when I saw it. A figure, tall and emaciated, standing just beyond the tree line. It had the body of a man, but twisted, elongated, with limbs that seemed too long and skin stretched tight over bones. Its face was hollow, eyes sunken, and its mouth hung open, as if it was forever screaming in silence. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was the way it smiled at me. It was Dan's face, but it wasn't. His eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, and his mouth was full of sharp, broken teeth that glistened with blood. He took a step forward, and I stumbled back, tripping over a root buried under the snow. I scrambled to my feet and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest twisted around me, branches clawing at my face, trying to hold me back. The growls grew louder, echoing all around, as if there were dozens of them closing in. I could hear it behind me, the heavy crunch of snow, the guttural breaths, and that awful voice calling my name, over and over. "Mason! Mason!" I didn't stop until I broke through the tree line, back onto the trail. I stumbled down the path, barely able to catch my breath, until I reached the ranger station. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it, my body shaking as I collapsed into a chair. By the time backup arrived, the snow had already covered any trace of the footprints or the tent. Jim and the others thought I was crazy, said I'd been out in the cold too long, that I was seeing things. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Dan McClure was never found. They say he vanished without a trace, another victim of the unforgiving woods. But I know better. I know what's out there, lurking in the snow, waiting. And every winter when the snow falls thick and the nights grow long, I can still hear him. My name, whispered on the wind, a faint, hollow echo, waiting for me to come back,